like people are joining in. Welcome. I'm Dr. Sheena Mason, the host of Free Your Mind, the podcast, and the creator of Theory of Your Racelessness. Theory of your racelessness and mine. I'm here today again with my new friend Tade, who's a geneticist and a professor at a university in Brooklyn, New York. And we are back for a part two of our part one of our two-part discussion. I'll put the link to the part one in the chat box or in the description box for anyone who's interested in catching up. But today we're looking to explore further this idea of genetics, biology, and racelessness and race. And we are open to questions that you may have, as this is certainly a complicated topic. And I'm just blessed and privileged to be able to have a geneticist come and answer questions that people ask me that I just do not have the knowledge or training to properly answer, as well as somebody like Tade with his experience and expertise can. So Tade, welcome back to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me again.
You're welcome. It's good to be here.
Awesome. So I know you mentioned that there was a student who reached out to you with some questions and you wanted to make sure to answer and address those questions. And I'm sure the student isn't the only person with such questions. So if you could, why don't you let us know what the question is and then how you would respond? That'd be great.
Yeah, so it was a two-part question. They had just seen a talk by I think a professor who wrote a paper called Embracing Genetic Diversity to Improve Black Health. And it talked about how race correlates to genetic variation based on ancestral origin and how it needs to be factored into clinical trials to provide equitable treatment to different populations. So she was saying basically, how does this square with the theory of racelessness? And if you believe this paper, how can you be a skeptic when it comes to race, right? And I think I would think, I don't know if I'm a skeptic, but I think that probably describes closest to how I feel about the concept of race. I'm pretty skeptical of claims made involving race. But I think it's fair to address both of those. So the first thing is this discussion of how race relates to DNA, which relates to your genetic ancestry, right? So in the paper, I think they give 15%. I would quibble with that and say it's closer to 10%. But the point is, we do know that we can separate people, and especially in like most countries, broadly based on what looks like race or geography. I would say, 10% of the genome is not the majority. And it's not that we can separate people into race. It's just that humans evolved in Africa, and they spent a long time in Africa. And then there were sort of major bottlenecks out. And I won't get into the math of sort of how we do this. I think that's something that I can write and I can share with you in the future. But you can kind of imagine, okay, humans, they left Africa, they settled in the Near East. So the people that came to dominate in Europe, which wasn't all of them, right? Some of them had already left to Europe like 40,000 years ago. Some of them went to Europe and came back into Africa. In fact, there's places like in West Africa, the Yoruba, if you sequence them, like 12% of their genome looks like it came from it. Well, this stuff with like ancient genes is hard, but it probably came from Europeans from like 25,000 years ago that left, came back, right? And we don't know sort of how long ago they went. And, we used to think, oh, there's no Neanderthal DNA in Africa. We found out actually there is. So with genetics and history, almost everything that can happen has happened to at least some small extent. But the point is, 20,000 years ago, around the last glacial maximum, things did change a little bit because the Sahara got hotter. And basically, for example, the sea between, Serbia and Croatia and Italy, 20,000 years ago, you could almost like walk across that, right? And you have sort of this, things got warm. And things started to change, and you had a small population. So what we say, if you look at a population of people from Africa, you compare it to population of people from like Europe, you'll see that the effective size of the population in Africa is bigger. Basically, what that means is they haven't had a small bottleneck as recently. So that small bottleneck, you can still sort of see that signature and it affects sort of, around 10% of the people's, their genome, not their genes, but their genome. And then you can see that as those people moved around, we also had a bottleneck in like East Asia. So there's some small signature there. But remember that whole time when that bottleneck was happening, there was no, there was no equivalent event in West Africa and East Africa to cause there to be blackness, right? It's basically as humans left Africa, there's some like major events that you can see to some extent in people's genome. But that part of your genome, and one thing that's important to understand with genetics, right? And this is actually important for like coronavirus, for all genetics, is that genes acquire mutations and your genome acquires mutations. And remember, most of your genome is not your genes. And genetic time is measured in mutations, right? So each person, so Sheena has, 7 to 10 variants that no one else in the world has. And those make you, right? And then your kids would have another 10, and their kids would have another 10, and their kids would have another 10, right? And so if you're separated from your great-grandparents, your great-great-great-grandparents, 1,000 years ago, and somehow it was all inbred, right? With just, the same family, just like, like E. coli or something, right? Just like always replicating. In time, they would acquire like different, in time, the DNA will change. And we can use that to measure time. Time in generations, not years, but generations is approximately years. We say generation has to be at least 15 to like 40 years, right? But those mutations that you acquire are not going to be in genes. And it's because if they're in genes, they usually kill you, right? So if you have a mutation in like an enzyme that you need for life, you wouldn't be alive. So the mutations that sort of pile up fast are the mutations that don't do anything. So most mutations don't do anything. And then some mutations do something. And the majority of the mutations that do something will just kill. They're bad. And occasionally there's a mutation that happens that's selected for. So there's a few, so the mutation that, happened out that occurred when humans left Africa, then went into the north, then started farming. You saw mutations for fair skin that were selected for, but the mutations in that PCA, that bottleneck, those weren't selected for. That's just that the population got a little bit too small for a while, right? So, okay, it's 10% of the genome. It's 10% of the genome that occurs in people that left Africa and isn't in people that stayed in Africa. But then that 10% of the genome is concentrated in the parts that don't matter. So to me, that's a pretty weak argument for race, right? But if you want to make that, and also then race then has to be everybody who has ancestors in the last, or has like many ancestors, say more than 2/3 of their ancestors have left Africa in the major wave 20,000 years ago, like that becomes a race. But that again would include all kinds of people, not just white people, right? So you have a sort of to me, like that's a pretty big stretch to say race is real because we see a bottleneck in human migration. But then to extend it to, well, that's why we need to consider race in a clinical trial, because those variants probably are really important for disease. That's, again, another step. And there's two things I'll say about that. I'll say that there's this first argument that race has a genetic basis. And I say it's not a completely false argument, but it's super weak, right? So whatever, you want to rate that argument on a scale of 1 to 10, I give that like a 5. But sure, it's not a 0. Right? That's fair, right? The next argument is, does race matter for clinical trials? And I'll say there's two sort of examples where it does, and that's what people will like usually cite, right? And again, if you have a town in Minneapolis where like the Swedes, a bunch of Swedish immigrants came, and it was a few families 70 years ago, and then Somalis move in. And so you basically have two families who live there. You have people from Somalia and people from Sweden, right? Then the white and black people might have some genetic differences that matter for like drugs and like, health, like it wouldn't be right to do all your clinical trials on just half of the population. But white and black, they're just sort of, they happen to coincide with two, different extended families. So globally, that's not true, but locally, sure. I mean, locally, race can matter, but it always matters because it's a stand-in for something else. Then the other exception I'll make, which I think does matter when we talk about diversity and clinical trials, is my own research, and this is sort of unpublished, but well, the research is published, but this part of it isn't well discussed, and that's in samples that I collected, with a big group of people that are schizophrenia samples. So it's gene expression data from schizophrenics and controls. And one thing when I looked at the data that I found pretty interesting is that in the controls, the gene expression among the, so in this data set, we have African Americans, white Americans, and Hispanics. So I'm just going to take out the Hispanics because I think the point is made fine with just white and black, right? I'm just going to use the words white and black for like this part. It's just easier. The gene expression basically across all the genes, except for there's one pseudogene where it's not very significant, but it's a gene that we don't think is even expressed. So a pseudogene is transcribed, but not turned into protein. So it doesn't really matter. But with the exception of one pseudogene, the gene expression among white and black is almost identical, which is saying that even with what one should say is, okay, there's differences in the genome, but in the actual gene expression and how we read the genes and how we make proteins, we see almost identical gene expression among white and black, right? And again, this is brain. So yes, you're right. If you're thinking, ahead, don't black people produce more pigments for darker skin? Yes, if you looked at gene expression in skin, you would see that. But brain is pretty important, right? Because it's how we think. It's probably more important than skin. So in the brain, and this is neuroprogenitor cells. So this is sort of the developing brain that we're looking at. It's not the whole brain, but the developing brain, white and black controls have almost identical gene expression. But white and black schizophrenics are actually pretty different. So that's interesting, right? Because how could that be? So healthy white and black people are expressing the same genes in their brain. But white and black schizophrenics, something different's happening. And that's because, schizophrenia is an environmental disease, but it's also a genetic disease. So there's a genetic basis for it. We think it's, concordance, we say, is, maybe around 20%, which means that if you have an identical twin and you are a schizophrenic, the chance that they will be as well is around 20%, which is obviously a lot higher than the general population, a lot higher than a sibling, which I think is about 2 or 3%, right? So there's a genetic basis, but there's also some environmental triggers. So it could be, that white people in the population that I have, they use different drugs than black people, and drugs are a trigger for schizophrenia. Or white people are more likely to take a certain drug, and it could be, ironically, because we think there's genetic differences that matter for medication. We prescribe white people a certain drug and black people another drug, and then we'll see differences in gene expression in the schizophrenics, right? So there's a deep layer of irony, right? But it's that because we've treated these two groups in a different way, the way that their disease will manifest is different. So I would say that's where my only sympathy comes to this argument. I would say, okay, only in small cases can I see this idea that race is real enough to impart genetic differences in the DNA. I'm not convinced by that, especially I live in New York City. We have people from all over the world. Maybe if you're in a small town where there's two groups of people, but for me, it's hard to really respect that argument. I don't think the differences between the groups of people, I think the 10% of the genome that drives PCA is a pretty poor argument, but you do see massive differences. So that does say, if you do a gene expression study to develop a drug and you use only white people, you'll get a different result than if you use white and black people or only black people. So it does say that having some diversity in the people that you study is important. And it's because there's a difference in gene expression in people who have the disease across race. But the fact that there's no difference in controls sort of shows it's not actually their race that's causing that. So race isn't the underlying factor, but it is a factor. So I'm sympathetic to like the argument that diversity is important in medicine, right? And not just diversity for, cultural, diversity, that we need scientists who think in different ways, but even the patient population, there is an importance to have diversity there, because different diseases, they don't work the same in different in different groups. That's true, but it's not necessarily true because the healthy people of a different race are different because of the small fraction of their DNA that's different. So that's long and rambling, but I hope that made some sense.
Okay, so I'm thinking about how you said in terms of the usefulness of the category of race, you might, and on a scale of 1 to 10, you might give it a 5 or something to that effect.
That's a scale of 1 to 100.
Oh, 1 to 100. Oh, 1 to 100, you might give it a 5. I feel like that's an amendment. Okay, because that changes things. If it was 10, then I'd be like, okay, but you're still saying, 5.
I'm saying if it's 10% of the genome, 10% of the, well, it's not 10% of like the genome. That's not true. It's 10% of the SNPs. So of the bases that vary in the population, in all humans, across all humans, which is maybe 10 million, 20 million SNPs, right? It's not the entire genome, but of the spots that humans are different on, you can take 10% of those, and those 10% will segregate not the races, but will have a migratory significance. They'll be associated with human migration, and the association of those, there's going to be an out of Africa bottleneck that we call that PCA1, and that will like separate humans, those that have more ancestry in the out of Africa bottleneck 20, 30,000 years ago, and those that have less. That's 10%. But of course, that's not race, that's migration. So that's sort of how I came up with this grade. And then the fact is also those 10% are going to be super enriched in not being the variants that actually can like manifest in phenotype at all, right? These are going to be the mostly what we call non-functional, or now people think, well, maybe there's some function to the variants that aren't in genes because of binding or histone. So there's much lower function. So I'm going to say at a maximum it's 10% of the genome, but of the functional genome it's probably like 5%. So that's kind of how I came up with my grade. So it's like that's 5 out of 100 of how important it is.
Okay, got it. Thank you for restating that, because I definitely thought you said 5 out of 10.
No, 5 out of 10.
So I want to talk with you about something that strikes me of everything that you just explained, and this is something we keep trying to fidget with my lighting. This is something that we spoke about before we started recording, but I want to talk more extensively about it in this public sphere. So part of my work through Theory of Racelessness is it necessitates helping people stop conflating race with ethnicity and culture and everything else under the sun, like that which is considered to be metaphysical, everything. And in a lot of what I hear you describing in terms of our human genetics, it really speaks to the necessity or the benefits that can perhaps come from helping people disentangle race with ethnicity in particular, because although ethnicity is also, I think in some ways can be a sort of subjective or potentially problematic categorization, I do think it's more expansive than that of race and how people conceive of race. And I do see ethnicity as including the biological aspect that many people seem to want to elevate and uphold, but in a way that detaches the racism that often comes with the concept of race. I would say always comes with the concept of race. because some of what I also hear coming out of what you were saying is the history of scientific racism, right? When people were centuries ago convinced that there were biological differences among races of human beings, the premise was that, you know, our brain sizes were different, our skull sizes were different, all of these differing biological immutable characteristics translated into inferiority and superiority of the different racial categories. And in that way, because that is the history and the sort of genealogy of the concept of race in American society, once scientists really dispelled the notion of race as biological or as of nature, people turn to the category of race, and still in an effort to uphold the system of racism, and for some people in an effort to dismantle the same system of racism, the concepts of race continue to be under reconstruction. And part of the reconstruction efforts, something we spoke about prior to starting to stream, it was this idea of the civil rights being a sort of fight for human rights. And it strikes me that because the concept of race is rooted in the history of trying to prove inferiority and superiority, the continued upholding of these categories is what precludes people from seeing the humanity when race is specified. And that is ultimately part of the nefarious ways in which race and race ideology continue to operate. And one of the ways in which I think having an expanded understanding of what ethnicity is can be a door opening for a lot of people, because it includes the DNA and the biology and the ancestry that people really value for a variety of reasons. And it also includes things like culture and tradition and nationality, religion, right? All of the things that are meaningful to human society. But it's not, at least in the American context, it's not rooted in racism, because we understand that there are countless ethnicities even within the context of America.
Yeah, I mean, I think that my issue with ethnicity is that, I guess if you really like this diversity or this genetic differences that relate to our ancestry, I guess I think it sounds like what you're saying, that the motivation is like, why don't we do it better than race? Do one that's more accurate, right? Do one where we say, okay, like, you know, if you have these variants, that means that your ancestors left Africa. Sorry, that happens a lot here. That means that your ancestors left Africa, you know, 33,000 years ago, and you're part of this group. And we'll try to do better scientifically. I mean, my issue with like ethnicity, sometimes it does better again, but it's mostly just because there's more groups. But I mean, other times you'll be, you know, watching TV and there'll be a war and there'll be Serbians and like ethnic Albanians. And these people don't differ genetically at all, but like they have different religion and a different language, and sure. But I mean, you know, ethnicity is non-specific. So it doesn't have to encompass any difference in your DNA, or like, I mean, I think it, in some ways, ethnicity, even that to me is sort of somewhat of a problematic idea, because it says, okay, if you have differences in your language and your religion, well, you also clearly are like different humans. And I think like race is also like, to me, what we think of as race and white supremacy, I think it's a little bit revisionist history. I mean, I don't think it's necessarily true. Like, I don't know, have you heard of the so after Darwin, his brother, and I just pull it up, so that was for his name, Galton, and then his, you know, so basically there was this sort of Victorian group of people like John Eyre and all these Englishmen. These are the people that sort of that colonized Jamaica, right? And to them, the concept of race that they had was very different, right? So I don't know if you've heard of the group of people, the Bethnal Green Poor. Have you heard of them? So they would look at the Bethnal Green Poor, and there's a quote that they're a caste apart, a race of whom we know nothing, whose lives are of quite different complexion than ours, persons at which we have no point of contact. And the review suggested that these distinctions and separations, like those of the English classes, will always endure, will last from cradle to the grave, will prevent anything like association or companionship, produce an effect on the lives of the extreme poor, subject them to isolation, and it's very fair to parallel it as equal to the separation of slaves from whites. So they looked at the poor, lower class people in London and said that they are as different as us, the aristocracy, as slaves are from whites. So they were able to sort of dehumanize people and just create a race, right? So they said like they're just as different.
Right. And part of the central work of my book is pointing to the history of the word race, which was always used as a way to create a hierarchy in early modern Europe and before. And then the language of race was then adopted on the soil that would then become the United States. And in a way that supported and reified notions of inferiority and superiority in attempts to justify the enslavement of human beings. That's how race gets coded in the ways that we now think of it. But from its inception, the concept of race hasn't always meant what it means now when Americans especially think of racialized terms, but it has meant a sort of caste and class system. That part hasn't changed, and that's so at least from my view, it's not a revision of history to point out the fact that the concept of race has always been used to marginalize and exclude people and create a class hierarchy in societies, and that of course when the concept of race and then the language of whiteness and blackness was taken on American soil, or what would become American soil, it only served to reconstruct the meaning of race to reflect the hierarchy that was being created over here. And part of this then necessitates a deeper understanding of the genealogy of race, which goes back a very long time. There are entire compilations of narratives, travel narratives, scientific journals and things like that, where people are showing, okay, this is where race appears, either the word race or the sort of idea of race, the tying of race with ethnicity, all of this other stuff, really just race with difference. This is how it appears over time from like the 1400s. There are texts that have these compilations. So if you understand that the very concept of race hasn't always meant what it means today to Americans, but you also understand that the concept of race has always been rooted in hierarchy, then you understand how nonsensical it is to continue to uphold the idea of race, right? But that's a required expansion of knowledge in terms of how people think of it, because unfortunately it's the concept of race is so ingrained in American society that young children, we're taught since we're very young, these concepts that race is of nature and that it is tied to ancestry and phenotype. And even when people talk about it as a construction, they still tie it to biology and ancestry of phenotype. And then because of abolitionist efforts and then civil rights efforts after that, the concept of race, especially the category of blackness, continues to be conflated with everything under the sun. And the downside of all of that is, while it's had practical utility, it continues to be operating from the hierarchy that it has always been. So we would do well to recognize that and dismantle it. And while ethnicity still has its problems, because there are other nations that they don't necessarily have the concept of race as Americans do, and thereby racism doesn't travel, but there are ethnic wars, right? This is theory of racelessness. I'm not discounting that fact. And I'm not discounting the fact that human beings have other hierarchies that extend and include racism, right? But none of that is to say that this is not this is not a better path forward, the dismantling of race to dismantle the problem of racism in American society. And I think that'll lead to and encourage a proliferated understanding of ethnicity. Because like what I told you last time we spoke, I think of ethnicity in terms of American.
So I mean, it sounds like, I guess what you're saying is more dismantle race and reconstruct ethnicity.
Absolutely, because or even recognize
to that.
Right, because in some ways, I think people think of ethnicity because it's conflated with race. They think of ethnicity in pun intended, very black and white ways. Yeah. For instance, I recently spoke with some folks in Ireland. Shout out to Eric and Mamobo. About the concept of racelessness, and they happen to be of Nigerian descent, but they've been in Ireland since they were toddlers, and their families are, for all intents and purposes, Irish, and also Nigerian. And somebody on one of their accounts was responding to my conversation with them and trying to belabor the perceived ethnic differences between these people, their families, and the Irish, right? And you can see how this line of logic was going. They were trying to really insist very hard that ethnicity is, to your point, really rooted in DNA, and that because the DNA of Nigerians is so vastly different from the DNA of the Irish, that a person cannot become Irish, right? Or cannot, their families, if they have generations of children in Ireland, they can't magically become Irish, but they can become naturalized citizens. And I'm like, okay, that's all fine and well, but who benefits from that conception of what it is to be part of a nation? And how flattening of actual differences even among a population like the Irish is that? Because I know very little about Ireland, truth be told. But I can imagine that based on region and based on socioeconomics and so on, the dialect might change, right? The sound, the words that people use might change. The fashion might be different in some places. Maybe the foods might be different in some places, because I don't know, that's how it tends to operate in most nations. Mm-hmm. And yet those people would still view themselves as Irish. They wouldn't say, oh, because you're different from me, or you sound different from me, or you eat different foods or whatever, you're not somehow Irish. So the sort of revisioning of ethnicity, if you will, for me, the reconstructing of that will necessitate a proliferated understanding of culture and cultural formation, and how culture is part of ethnicity, a necessary part of ethnicity, how there's some choice as it pertains to ethnicity that is not available as it pertains to race, because race is really only rooted in nature by some people's imaginations, right? You don't choose the race that you're born in, according to some people. Mm-hmm. Whereas ethnicity, there is some choice, because you can convert to a different religion. You can participate in whatever culture you want, right? You can participate in many cultures. And you can move and become a citizen of a different nation and really dissolve your connections with your home country.
It's pretty clear that you can have a hybrid ethnicity.
Exactly.
You don't have to get put into one, whereas
right.
Race fails with hybrids, right? It makes either a new race, or it tells you you're like, in America, if you're mixed, you're black. And then in other countries, they create a whole new race for you.
Right. Yeah. Like, somebody called me a mixed race mutt recently.
Yeah. So that's your only options, right? But you can't really be both. You either make up a new race, or you are just one of those two races.
Yes.
Whereas ethnicity, you can actually be both, right? And so it's like, there's diversity in food in Ireland, but I think, if you're Nigerian and you eat Nigerian food, it's, like in Ireland, like jollof rice isn't a thing. So if you're eating that, you're not just a diverse Irish, though, because you're eating a food that's not popular, but it is popular somewhere else. So right. I would say that, but if you have an Irish accent, well, then you have a hybrid ethnicity.
Exactly. Right? And they sound Irish.
Jollof rice, then it becomes Irish, right? It becomes part of Ireland, right? But it's just, it's not, there's no time when that becomes an Irish food, but eventually it will be, right? If people like it, right?
Right.
But you can have it really makes sense to have more than one ethnicity at the same time. Whereas race doesn't really
Yes,
allow that. You can't really
at
have that,
all.
right? And you can only act like one, right? Because race is thought to be incredibly permanent, which is why it disappoints me when geneticists say, oh no, race is real because there's these 10% of the genome. And it's like, I don't think that's a helpful use. I don't think it helps to say, okay, well, let's make race more accurate by
Right.
renaming race. Okay, you can't have a black race, too much diversity in Africa, but you can have a non-black race of people that have this thing in their genome from like 30,000 years of like this bottleneck, we're going to name it as a race. I don't think that's helpful because it then could, I mean, especially because that's not how race has like ever functioned, right? So you're not, so it's disappointing when people find, I think, common out, like they find ways to use genetics to find associations with race and then argue that race has some value because of that. Because I don't see it, because that's not what race is, right? And that's not what race has been historically. It has not been a goal to try to find population bottlenecks and study human migration. That's like anthropology, right? Or like archaeology. It's not,
Yeah.
that's not the goal of race, right?
So something you said earlier that I want to talk more with you about, because it's making me think of one reason I think we ended up connecting on Twitter. You've spoken a bit about how geneticists, generally speaking, because I don't know if the claim can be made for all geneticists, because there are some people who would be naturalists, racial naturalists, who are really, 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 really convinced that race exists in any kind of, meaningful, substantial way. But you've said before that the majority of geneticists concede the point that, okay, if race exists, it's on the scale of helpfulness, it's like pretty low, closer to zero than anything else.
Yeah.
But yet, the kinds of research that gets funded are still subscribing to what I would call race ideology. And that something you said earlier about research done around diverse populations would prove more fruitful, because probably for a lot of reasons. But I want to invite you to talk more about that, and particularly, like, what are the roadblocks that you find yourself running into in terms of doing innovative types of research, and if you have any insight or speculation as to why, although they know that it's not, why they still are kind of upholding it as though it is,
Well,
in a
one
way.
reason, and I just wrote a grant and I got my comments back. So this just happened. So I can talk about this like very specifically is, and it's maybe they're right about this one, is that the argument is it's easier, right? And so if I say, like we got to look at why culture and why society manifests these differences. So like the classic example is in Africa, and in African Americans to a little bit less extent, but the same thing is true. You have, and this is going to get a little sciencey, but you have something called shorter LD blocks. Like that sounds hard, but basically the variance in the genome, right? So if you think of the genome, and this is something that we probably should discuss, because it's probably worth understanding. So we think of our genome, right? Like you and I, we each have 3 billion base pairs, right? And most of the time we're the same. But you can imagine, between you and I, there might be, I don't know, let's just to make it easy, it's it's probably like 5 million, but let's just say that there's 1 million spots where we differ. And let's just imagine that for all humans, there's only 1 million spots where any humans differ, right? So I might be an A and you might be a T, but of course, I have 2 chromosomes, so do you. So really, I could be A and A. It's like I got A from my dad, A from my mom, and you could be T and T, or you could be A and T. But what's interesting is if you're, say, T and T, and we take a third person, that person is also going to be either A or T. A person not going to be C or G. There's 4 bases. The humans are so similar that when we do like population, like when we do this, we imagine that there's only 2 bases at every spot, because really there is, like, there are examples where there's 3 bases found in humans, but they're like 1 in a million, right? And incredibly rare. So for the most part, humans are so similar that there's only 2 options. So basically you can only be, so basically what we do is we just code we code them. We say, okay, this first base, and it's totally an arbitrary construction, but it doesn't matter. So we can just say whichever one comes first in the alphabet, that's the reference base. So it could be A or C or G. T can never be like the reference base because it didn't come first. And then the other one is the alternate allele, or like the alternate base. And so the only spots that you can have on your genome are 0, 1, or 2. You either have 0 copies of the alternate base, you have 1 copy, or you have 2 copies, because you have 2 chromosomes. So we can basically turn the genome into just a bunch of numbers, right? Zeros, ones, and twos, right? Which is important to understand that that's what we're talking about when we talk about sort of what drives the, like when we talk about like how like far apart we are. What we do is we just take all of our spots and we just subtract like the total absolute like difference. Like that's a number, right? We all have that, like that number. And so when we talk about, you know, and of course those differences are not independent. So there's a correlation there, especially on a single chromosome when there's 2 like places in the genome that are close together. Well, so for example, you know, let's say on chromosome 5, position 1 million, let's say that you're an A. And let's say that, you know, again, AA, right? So you're a 0 and I'm TT, so which is 2. And then you move like a couple hundred base pairs down. And it's because, and there's another possible human variant where people are different. And if you're an A, let's say that might make you a G. But the fact that I'm not an A there, the fact that I'm a T, like 1,000 base pairs before, means I'm also less likely to be a G, because the variants are correlated. And that's because when we inherit our DNA, we inherit the whole chromosome, maybe recombined once, but we inherit big pieces of DNA. So it's not, so the variants that we inherit are not independent, right? And so if you think about a population with a smaller effective population, right? Imagine just a founder of just like 2 families. They're going to have sort of less possible like options to inherit. And, you know, after a long time, they're going to, because when you cut the chromosomes, you will usually cut them once. So this huge chromosome, there's going to be one cut somewhere. So it's not going to cut the pattern between most of these bases. And so in the African populations, because humans have been there for so long, the correlation between the bases is smaller. So they're less related. But, and I would say this is sort of a big irony, right? So like the thing that defines the race of African people is that they're less of a race than all the other people, right? Is how unrelated they are. So when people say, oh yeah, like it's really important to get some African samples for genetic reasons. Well, because those African samples are not related to each other, right? So that's, I know that's a little bit like complicated, but that's important because, but that again gets confused in the heads of people because they can, that's a fair argument to say, okay, we need more diversity. And then there's this word that I hear a lot in science now that it came out in like the last 3 years where we need diverse people. And then you talk about, you're a diverse individual. It's like, well, how can a person be diverse? It's one person, right? But they say this person's diverse, right? Like diverse, like genomes, but it's really just means unrelated. So you have these sort of smaller, but then you hear that, and then people say, we need more Black people for genetic reasons. And then the next, but then there's also like medical genetics, which sort of exists in some ways a world apart from population like genetics. And I think that's a lot of the confusion comes from there. Medical geneticists have long been saying, oh, like, these diseases probably manifest differently in white and Black people in the US. And there's population, geneticists who are saying we need to study, height or some disease. And if we use the European populations, it's harder because they have sort of more correlation because they're more inbred or more related to each other. We need to use populations from Africa because you have less correlation on the genome because they're less related, right? So it's sort of like saying I can go to Nigeria and grab a bunch of people, and it's as if I went to Europe and I grabbed someone from like 15 different countries. So there's a benefit that's easier, right? I spend less time and I get more diversity, which for some things I want. For other genetic studies, you want people all in the same family, right? But it says that there's an advantage there. But so I think what's happened in like genetics is we have the like medical like like that argument. And my argument there is what I just said for the gene expression in like schizophrenia. Yes, there's a difference. The schizophrenics, the white and black schizophrenics have different gene expression, right? But that's society, because the white and black controls don't. So that's sort of an error, that we've assumed that they must have different genomes, which drives their difference in disease prevalence. And then the fact that they do have different genomes, but not different genomes in that the black people have a genome in common and the white people have a genome in common. It's that the black people actually have, there's more diversity in Africa, so they have even less in common, right? So I think, I mean, again, it's complex, but I think that's where a lot of the mistake is made, because you have the same people that are all scientists and they all do, but they have very different like motivations. And some of the medical genetics sort of survives. I think that mistake sort of survives because there is a real need for diversity. And I do think that, to be fair, it does matter that schizophrenia looks different in these like populations. But I don't think that suggests that, like, I mean, the fact that it doesn't look different different in the controls, I think that suggests that, like, it's not coming from the race differences. The race differences manifest because of society. The genetic differences in populations exist because you have different levels, you have different ages of populations. The populations don't have something in common. They actually have even less in common with each other in one place, right?
This is if you can't tell, I'm riveted. I'm I'm into this. I want to talk about complicated, but fortunately I have the intellectual.
It's like something that I forget sometimes. It's like, yeah, God, this is very hard to explain. And
well, like, you're getting
it's so different, right? Yeah, like
you're getting some practice rounds. Fortunately for you, I have the intellectual apparatus to stay with you, especially because I do have the knowledge that people on the continent of Africa, when genetically compared to each other, are more diverse than when compared to people anywhere else on the globe. And that, for me, underscores the sort of fallacy of the idea of race, or at least the belief in race as being a sort of neat and tidy thing. And when you're talking about schizophrenia and how it manifests differently in racialized populations, that to me is sort of highlighting the problem of racism, meaning the belief in races, right? And race is the hierarchy that then influences the ways in which people are treated for the same disease based on how they're racialized from the person who's treating them. And then it sort of tricks people into thinking and believing more in the idea of race, because then upon analysis, if we're doing it across racialist lines, then it's a self-fulfilling prophecy in a lot of ways. And that's also making me think about the Tuskegee experiment incident, because I know you told me about a different case study that happened, and we were both kind of minds blown, because we took it as, okay, that happened because of racism, but not the racism that people presume, right? Yeah. So talk to me. I forget the name of the other experiment. Can you talk about that? OSLO. That's what I was going to call it.
Yeah. The OSLO experiment was done first. All right. So it drove the need to do the Tuskegee. And it's fascinating to me because I see it's almost like this. It sounds so familiar to what happens now. It's almost scary. That's like, wow, like that same line of thinking. Like we sometimes think that we're so far ahead, but like, so basically, like, 1920 or something, a long time ago, they did a experiment on untreated syphilis. And so the narrative around the Tuskegee experiment is I'm not gonna say it's fake or it's a hoax, but it's somewhat exaggerated, right? Because syphilis now we have penicillin, and like that's widely available. We know it works. But the two treatments for syphilis in like 1920 was arsenic and penicillin. And there was, right? So, I mean, when you have those two, you can see how you might not want to treat it. And then syphilis has like long periods where it's totally dormant, right? Like syphilis is sort of weird. There's a time that if you treat it, it'll go away. There's a time when like it's dormant, like nothing will happen, but then it'll come back. So there was a question of like, should you treat syphilis? Should you treat someone who has syphilis that has no symptoms? Like, what should you do? And the Oslo syphilis experiment was a study in syphilis in people from Norway. And there was a, it seems like a somewhat well-meaning group of people. I think they were, I could be getting this wrong, but I believe they were somewhere like in the north or the eastern seaboard, Virginia or somewhere. And there was actually like a movement, right, to actually put, to make some like money available to repeat the experiment in the American Negro. And the idea was, well, the American Negro is, a different subspecies. How does syphilis work there? That's the first thing to understand is like, yes, they already, and then the sort of thing that makes it sort of the reason why we think of this as a like racist study is, yes, the truth is the Oslo experiment ended in like 1925 or something. The Tuskegee experiment went along, it went for a longer time period, and they were still untreated. And at that point, the evidence that penicillin should be used was growing, right? But so the impetus to even do the experiment, right? So it wouldn't have happened if there wasn't this idea that we need to try something in the white population and a black population. Like basically, like there was an argument that like to do the right science, be a good, equitable scientist, we should repeat the experiment in a black population, right? Like that was that they thought that would be a useful thing for science, right? Mm-hmm. And so they, gave some money to the Tuskegee Institute, and they started this experiment. And if you look at the sort of, if you really dive deep into this, there's a few guys, Montague, there's I forget his other name, is it? I think his name is Ron White, a few doctors from Tuskegee, and they're all Black doctors. And some of them are sort of defensive about the Tuskegee experiment, because if you look at some of the claims made against it, it says they didn't treat them. But if you look at the actual data, they treated in the controls who were not supposed to be untreated, they only treated 30% of them. And that's because like, that was like, those are the ones that the doctors thought, okay, treatment is a good idea for them. And then in the treatment group, the untreated group, they actually did treat some of them. They treated like 26% of them. So like there was a small difference in treatment. And then what happened was sort of these books came out in the 70s. There was a newspaper story, and I mean, we shouldn't like racialize people, but I don't think it's totally a coincidence that sort of a lot of the backlash against the Tuskegee experiment came out way after. And so, and I don't know how true this is, but one of the doctors who's quite old now, who I think he may even be the son of one of the doctors, he makes the point that the book, there's a scathing book that came out in like the 70s, and sort of blew it like wide open, and investigative book. He says that it can't be a coincidence that every picture in the book shows a Black person being treated by a white doctor. And there's like 3 out of the 14 doctors were white. And that the person hid the fact that they really pushed this like racial narrative that like these white doctors are doing this racist thing. And sure, like I think there's a difference between quibbling and saying like this was bad science, or that maybe had this been a white population, they would have pushed for treatment sooner. All those things can be true, but I think that like the story sells better as a racialized attack. Then ironically now things like the Tuskegee experiment are like referenced in response to why we need more health, health disparities and health like equity research, and we need to do things on Black populations. And that sort of was the impetus of it. So you kind of see that there is a field of people who sort of problematize and like the history and say, oh, these people in the past were like, they were racist. We're not. We are interested in health equity among Black people. But yes, maybe they're not as kind as people are today. Maybe like that's definitely true. The being a human like research subject, no matter what like race you were in the 50s, was worse. You had like just less rights. But their initial error is the same one that we're making. Like maybe we shouldn't make that initial error again, even if we make it with a more kind like IRB and like we treat people better. Like like that's probably not the main problem there, right?
Yes, the error in subscribing to racialist ways of looking at and researching and thinking about people
Yeah.
and populations, because I think when you initially sent me that information, it was, at least a month or so ago, and I did the research, and I did more research on the Tuskegee experiment, and I found them to be pretty comparable in terms of the methods and the pretty bad outcomes.
Yeah.
And I can't say that I was surprised, but I think I was in some ways surprised in how I can't remember if I told you this last time we spoke, because I don't know if I developed this since we spoke, but I've recently come around to defining racism as the belief in race as a construction or as something in nature. And whereas traditional definitions of racism will say, like a Kendian version of defining racism would be something like the belief in racial superiority or inferiority of any race group, right? I've come to recognize that race is the hierarchy, whether you see it as something of nature, scientific racism, eugenics, biological racism, same thing, right? All of those things, or whether you see it as a social construction, that at the core of what people have identified and done with race in terms of constructing and reconstructing has been manifested from a sort of designing the hierarchy and then upholding the hierarchy. So for me, I'm defining racism now as quite simply the belief in the concept of race as a construction or as something in nature. And unlike many people, I don't assign any moral judgment on people who I would consider to be racist or part of the problem, right? And I think that moral suasion that is sort of underlining and emphasizing the morality of a person being racist or not, or a system being racist, a nation being racist or not, hasn't done much good in terms of helping people reconcile and unify. And so that's part of my strategy for also removing the morality that I'm, putting into the identification.
I would say it does good for two groups of people. So people that problematize the historical events like Tuskegee as racist, they can write books and they can make a lot of money talking about the moral case against racism. And I think it serves as a good cover for basically big business, for politicians to be able to point to a group of people and saying they're morally flawed because they're racist. We're not. And I think so I think it is pretty useful. I mean, not in maybe good ways, but I think it persists because it's very useful. And it's I saw something that I was just shocked by. It was an argument that Black people in America are unwilling to get vaccines because of the Tuskegee experiment. And that's why we should give them priority to vaccinate them first, which sounds funny because it seems like if people are hesitant, telling them that they're first might not be the best idea. But also on top of this, it's this idea that it's not their fault that they're hesitant because it's these bad people that were racist that caused them to be it. We should blame them, and we shouldn't blame any structures that actually sort of help people in power. The people, yes, if there were the racist attitudes that say maybe allowed the Tuskegee experiment to not treat people when they should have, aren't really helpful to people in power. But for example, I think it diverts the conversation by saying, yes, these people are vaccine hesitant because of these people who had racist attitudes. That's why you shouldn't have racist attitudes. But then at the same time, by saying that, it allows you to address the disparity in vaccination without bringing up things like the fact that the US is one of only 2 countries in the world where you can advertise pharmaceutical drugs on TV. That doesn't exist anywhere else. Maybe that makes people vaccine. Or the fact that in 2005, Vioxx was a drug that was approved and killed way more Black people than the Tuskegee experiment. And that just happened. And these same pharma companies are the pharma companies that we're supposed to trust, right? So I think that it allows you to historicize and make it a moral issue that people in the past had, and some people today have, but the people that have that are bad people, i.e. not us. So listen to us. And so I think race is super useful for these people, right? Like, I mean, it's like the ultimate like rhetorical play is to invoke race and racism, and you don't have to confront all the actual disparities and all the real reasons, which the real reasons are always tough.
That's exactly right. Yeah, it's the thing. The problem of racism and racialist ideology is useful in that it perpetuates racism. Yeah. And people profit off of the perpetuation of racism, as you just said. And I think it's also useful, both historically and today, in keeping people separated across presumed racial lines, which is, to some people, and probably too many people, that doesn't seem to be troubling or problematic. But through my work, I see that as wholly problematic, because the people who actually benefit from racism, that is the belief in race, but even if we define it as the belief in inferiority and superiority, the people who benefit from racism, regardless of how one defines it, is a very, very, very small percentage of people. But it's made out to be as if the majority of people in the country who are racialized as white benefit from this thing. And that's just not accurate. It's not accurate, because the concept of race and the problem of racism has been used and weaponized to inspire people racialized as white to see their interest as aligned with other people who are racialized as white, because there was a time after emancipation when those same people were voting with African Americans. Yeah. Because they saw that their interests were aligned. And then racialized white people who actually held socioeconomic political power in the country and its particular states burned down entire governments, inserted their own people into power once they saw how the vote was playing out, and then started this propaganda campaign in newspapers and magazines that had this racialized Black beast who was raping racialized white women. Right. And really antagonizing what people today would call race baiting people to really start to view themselves within these racialist boxes as separate and distinct. And the fact that more people aren't necessarily able, or sometimes are unwilling to recognize that and the depth of that, and how very few people actually benefit from upholding that narrative, from missing or lacking the nuance and understanding, in this example, the Oslo experiment and the Tuskegee experiment, but there are countless other examples that we could call to or point to. That is all part of the machinery of racism. Yeah. And the concept of racelessness is just part of the solution, or a solution, an alternative way of viewing and thinking about all of these things, the complexity of human beings, while still giving them more people, I should say, by them, more people, what they want, which is an acknowledgement of historical and contemporary racism, but in a way that doesn't maintain, create, or uphold racism in any direction, right? In a way that also helps people feel liberated from the baggage that racism puts on all of us. Because regardless of how we're racialized, there's a weight that we carry, each one of us, and I want to take an opportunity to invite you to ask me any questions that, might be pressing in terms of, do you have any questions for me about the theory of racelessness, or how I see this working in society, or any aspect of it? I just want to open the floor.
So I guess when you talk about, I assume you're referring to like Tulsa or something when you say that about burning.
No, but that would be one example. But the one, the one I'm thinking about is actually, I want to say late 1800s, maybe early 1900s. I think North Carolina or South Carolina. I would have to look up the exact information. But yeah, there's a lesser known instance of racialized white people voting alongside racialized Black people because they recognize their interests as being the same. So they voted into the local government racialized Black person, and other people, the elites of the country who happened to be racialized white people, saw the election results, came into town, literally burned down the town hall or whatever the governing building was.
So this is the elites burning down. Oh, okay.
That's right.
Yeah.
They chased the elected politician out of town and basically threatened his family's lives. And so that person fled. And then they inserted their own person into power. And then ensued with a propaganda race baiting, that is racism baiting campaign to basically ensure that the next election wouldn't be the same problem, wouldn't keep happening, that these racialized Black people wouldn't be voted into power. So is this because they were statistically outnumbered?
Is that the start of like the Southern strategy or something, basically?
I don't know if it's the start, but it's definitely a continuation of it.
Instances of like where like, so would you say that white people that did that were essentially tricked?
That participated and sort of bought into the narrative?
Well, that changed their vote, basically. They're like, oh shit, like, oh shoot, I don't want to, I'm scared now. Let me vote against these people that are a different race than me.
I think that they were manipulated, certainly. Yeah. I don't know. I couldn't say that the majority of those people voted in the other direction out of fear, or if they were compelled by the racist depictions of racialized Black people.
Fear of Black people, not fear.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Exactly.
Elites, but yeah.
Yes. And this distinct belief in an innate, that is inborn difference between Black people and white people that leads to Black people being inferior and white people being superior, and therefore white people being better equipped to be in power.
Yeah, it's weird. It's almost like the idea between like the idea of power, right? So the idea is that there's these elites and they're sort of tricking people into buying into race when it's like useful for them. But like the assumption that you have to make is this massive level of race loyalty, which doesn't seem to be historically true at all, right? Historically, they like nobody's that race loyal. Like, so the idea that like these elites were really like looking out for these white like people that were voting for Black people, that they cared about them, or that they just wanted them to vote differently, right?
You know what's interesting is because this idea of race loyalty, to my view, and because of how I see race for what it is a fallacy. I see it as being a distinctly American happening, which isn't to say that racism doesn't exist anywhere else like it does here. But I think in terms of how racialized groups of people were manipulated by the media, but manipulated by the school systems and so on, to see themselves as separate and distinct from other people. I see that as ultimately, I can't remember what you just said and where I was going with
that it seems like, so for example, the reason I brought up the Bethnal Green Poor was it's interesting because we talk about America and the history and 1619 and 1776, and the Bethnal Green Poor was like 1800s. So it's like this idea that the U.S. was founded on white supremacy and this is a benefit to all white people. Then you look at this isn't England. I mean, this isn't the U.S.
I remember. Yes.
In 1890, you have these white scientists and they're looking at the white like working class and the white poor, and they're saying like these people are a different race than us. Like they're no race. I mean, they have a different. Well, I guess they're race loyal, but they have a different construction of race. Where like people that we would call are the same. I mean, to stay race loyal, that they just change what race is, right? So in America, we would say like those are white elites and white poor, but to them they would say no, these are a different race than us. These poor people are not us.
Yes, I think this
Shows the
is this is part of the sort of misconception that I see happening often enough in today's society that I'm addressing it in my book. But there's a way in which people in the US talk about the concept of race, and they talk about it in ways that reflect a sort of essentialized notion of race and reflect this sort of belief that indeed so-called white people will always protect their interests, and therefore so-called Black people should protect theirs, that kind of thinking, right?
Yeah.
And it begs the question of, okay, is that outcome of people protecting their interests, is it racial? Is it rooted in the concept of race? The fact that people see themselves as a particular race and thereby they're trying to protect the entire race, right? The interests of the entire race. So what I was trying to say earlier before it leapt out of my mind was that I think because of how whiteness and Blackness and race by extension were constructed in America, that it's ultimately what's being pointed to as being racial and protecting one's racial interest is actually more accurately identified as something like protecting national interests. And I see, but it gets coded in the language of white versus Black, right? And I see similar things happening today because there's a whole wave of people who, as soon as you start to criticize anything about the nation, America, they feel very compelled to speak out against any criticism and critique, because it's very much as though something can't be both good and bad, kind of speaking to our efforts to break the binary of Black and white for these reasons, because people aren't encouraged to see themselves as the complex human beings that they are, because race language and race concepts preclude that complexity or obscure that complexity and make things more homogenous. And part of theory of racelessness requires the ability to translate race into more specific and more accurate identifications of what's happening in any given time and place, because it might be the case that racialized white people back then, and perhaps many racialized white people now, were, because they acted out against racialized Black people, it was perceived to be a racist effort or move, and therefore a sort of upholding of the white race, right? But in actuality, if we really did the analysis, we would come to recognize it more succinctly as a sort of national effort, and an effort to protect the national interest, and it manifested itself in race language, because that was the easiest way to manipulate people into doing what protected the elite's interest, right? Again, a very small minority, but it's a way that the language gets coded and manifests so that the majority of people see it as see themselves in it and see themselves as necessarily participating in upholding particular interests, including the sort of blind, faithful love for one's country that cannot be critiqued and all of that other stuff. And I think when you're able to help people outside of the Black and white and outside of that really binary way of thinking about both our history and what happens today, we can recognize that one can criticize, and probably should criticize, the nation, right? And if we identify America as having been rooted in this thing called white supremacy, I really just translate that into racism. Yeah. If you see America as being rooted in racism, to my mind, that it might be meant to impugn America, and it probably is by many people who would say that kind of thing. But I also tend to interpret it in a more gracious way, which is to say that racism was part of America even before America became America officially, by like a century. Mm-hmm. But that's not all America is, was, has been, will be, or can be. And again, while right now it might not be profitable to help people outside of this box to embrace and see themselves as raceless and to imagine a future in which racelessness is truly attained. um, it might not be profitable right now, but if people are sincere about reconciliation and actually an actual resolution, then Theory of Racelessness offers people a way to acknowledge the problem and see the complexity of America, because it also requires an acknowledgement of the complexity of humanity. Whereas race language really precludes people from seeing the complexity, because there's a way in which, ironically, now whiteness is being categorized as all of these like evils and all of this really bad stuff in a lot of ironic ways, because that's how blackness was initially conceived and created. And then we spent centuries trying to reconstruct the concept of race, thereby reconstructing what it means to be Black, to reinsert and assert the humanity of racialized Black people. But because the effort, instead of discarding the category and seeing it for what it was, which is a continuation of racism, we've kept the category, we've kept the language, and we've continued to write everything under the sun into the category. And so now you see this constant refrain of trying to still write the humanity and insert the humanity into the category of Blackness, while ironically talking about whiteness in a way that to me underscores my point that it's framed as racial, and people will tie it to race because the language is there, and we understand that people are racialized in these categories of being white or Black or whatever. But there's something metaphorical that's really happening here that's being pointed to. It's just too easy to miss because we're doing it from within the box of race. So we see ourselves as racialized, and so all of the feelings that come with that recognition, which I think is a painful recognition, just sort of all the way around, just recognizing the gross injustices that all people have inflicted onto other human beings for the entirety of the existence of humanity. And also at the same time, recognizing all of the beauty that human beings have continued to give this world. Where the race language really precludes people from marrying those two things and seeing themselves as both good and bad, ugly and beautiful, American, and still rightfully being able to criticize or try to improve or help America live up to her ideals better, right? Which doesn't mean that one doesn't love America. It doesn't mean that one thinks America is only bad or only racist. Again, it's like race ideology is the thing that precludes people from having more nuanced conversations. And because we see ourselves within the category of race, it then makes it hard to see how the category of race itself in American history, it's actually all of these other things under the sun, which really are metaphysical and not racial at all.
So really, it's the presence of darker skinned people in the US is, I guess you would say. So like, in 1880 in London, there weren't very many Black people, but there was a lot of really poor white people. So the elites looked at them and decided that they were a different race. Whereas in the US, the calculus was like a little bit like different. There were these, post Reconstruction former slaves. And so the US, people in power instead looked across the people and said, okay, we need to get these people, it was also a democracy, but they said we need to get these people to vote for us. So let's convince these people to think those people are different than them. But it was all in serving their interests, right? And that's unfortunately sort of the history of like everywhere. And then of course there's exceptions, right? There's people who said let's not do that, right? And those are the people that we should like celebrate, right? They're like abolitionists, and it's John Brown, right? They're people on all sides who are sort of the good stories. But yeah, there was a lot of that. And it's sort of almost in some sense, America's history as a racist nation isn't really true. It was a consequence of being a democracy, right? If you think of it like that, I mean, it seems, do you think there's any truth to that actually? I've never thought that before, but would you say that this idea that America has a history of white supremacy is really a consequence of America being a democracy quite early? right? And that race would not have needed to be invoked had there not been this idea that, you know, people want to maintain power, and you can't maintain power without voting.
I think it's more complicated than that, because the voting stuff comes primarily after emancipation, right? Which America coming into fruition in 1776, and the concept of race as we now think of it in terms of black, white, person of color, that stuff started happening in the late 1600s, so even before America gained independence. And it's one of those things where at the outset, the creation of racism in these ways was really reflective of those people still maintaining their power, those people being the elite. So I think that to my mind is an accurate sort of conclusion or interpretation of the historical record, which still to me is more complicated than I hear many people interpreting the same history now, largely because they're looking at it from within the box of racialist ideology. But if you're able to step out and be a little more clear-eyed, then you see that while it's pretending, it being race, is pretending to benefit more people than not, it really is benefiting almost no one. And that to me has been true since the inception of race ideology in pre-American society turned America. Yeah. And I think that's one of the downsides for continuing to think along these lines and to think within the confines of racism, that is the belief in race, because it really does strip a lot of nuance and complexity from history, from how we look at ourselves and each other, from how we practice anti-racism in ways that, again, just allow the problem of racism to persist. But fortunately, there's a way out. It's just a matter of getting more visibility and getting more traction.
Had the country, I mean, this is just like a thought experiment, but like, had the country not been a democracy post Reconstruction, would there have been this need to burn things down and scare people into not voting across racial lines? Like, would there have been this need to drive this? Like, is this a consequence of people in power being pretty rational and saying, like, we want to maintain power? These working class people are teaming up, and we have these white and black people forming a coalition against us. Let's break that up using racism. And the only reason that they broke that up is they needed votes, right? It's sort of votes. And, like, in some ways, it's like the good thing about democracy is, like, you have to have some semblance of majority or like public opinion that shapes who's in power. And so is a way to shape public opinion. In today, I mean, the parallel today is, I mean, I remember 20 years ago when I was young, but the FBI was convinced that the biggest threat was Islamic terrorism. And this was, a way to like justify wars and, get people to vote for certain, politicians, Bush and Cheney. And, we had this whole, we didn't really talk about whiteness and white supremacy back then, but we talked about Islamic terror and whether these wars were just and, weapons of mass destruction. And there was this movement to just remind people, like, these people are a threat to you, like these people are dangerous, and like, so you should probably like listen to us because we got this. And now you see the FBI has just come out with their biggest threat to the country is white supremacy. And so it's just hard because I see that, I'm like, well, the last time they told us about a threat, I don't think it was necessarily so much, I mean, it was less to protect us and more to maintain power. So how can I be sure that this is an honest threat, or is this a threat that's going to further, goals politically for elite people?
Yeah, I think if more people translated white supremacy as racism, that is the belief in race, then I would tend to agree that it is a threat. I don't know, I can't measure how much of a threat it is to the US, but I think if we continue down this rabbit hole, then it's reliving constantly the cycle racialist ideology has had on American soil. And as a republic with a democratic process, I think that we fare kind of poorly in terms of how the game gets played by the elite. And in the elite, I'm including politicians and that sort of thing, because there's a way in which people are encouraged to vote based off of emotion, usually, right? Like we go through the whole song and dance of pretending to care about people's policies and all of that, but most people vote largely because of emotion. And there is plenty of emotion to be had as it pertains to racialist ideology, as we've been talking about. And whether you are racialized Black and you are encouraged or presupposed to vote Democrat, because again, it's this idea of the Democrats or people who lean left presenting themselves as though they are the good guys. They are the anti-racist. They are the ones who have the interest of the interests of Black people at heart, right? So vote for me because if you're Black, right, you're going to vote Democrat. And that's why you have the instance of Joe Biden saying you ain't Black if you don't vote for him. He's sort of painted to be this really racist guy who's saying this really racist sentiment. But if you know anything about the history that we've been unveiling throughout this conversation, then you come to see more clearly that he's speaking an idea that many people believe, which is that if you are racialized a particular way, you're expected to vote a particular way. So it works against all people who are racialized, which is everyone in this country, regardless of how one is racialized, primarily because race ideology continues to preclude people from seeing things more logically outside of the box racism creates for all of us. And so long as it continues to obscure the reality, kind of like what you're saying within your field, which is where I see a lot of overlap, then we will continue to be limiting ourselves in terms of the solutions that we can bring to the table and how we solve problems that mean something to people that's cast as a sort of outcome of racism, but is really at its root probably something else that we're misnaming and misidentifying because racist ideology is still staying with us in the category of race. And so long as that continues to be true, it really is a shame, but politics and politicians, I should say, do capitalize on this to the umpteenth degree. And whether it's intentional, whether it's subconscious, whether it's a combination.
Right? Like the way that the Democrats at least do it, like if you're Black and you vote Republican, you're stupid. If you're white and you vote Republican, you're racist. So like there's a different motivation depending on whether you're white or Black.
No. If you are Black and you vote Republican in the US, you are called a white supremacist. You are
also called stupid because you're acting against your interest, right? Like that's sort of the idea. Like, why would you vote against what the people that are on your team? Like that's foolish.
Sure.
Right? But if you're white and you vote for that, then you're actually voting in your interest, but you're a bad person for doing that. Right? Like a white person should vote for a Republican, but that makes them a bad person because they're voting to aid their own benefit of their whiteness, right? They're voting for whiteness. So they're evil, but they're not stupid.
It makes them a bad person because it makes them racist. And hear me when I say this, racialized Black people get accused of being racist and white supremacists when they're Republican.
They get accused of being racist and stupid, whereas a white person is sort of they're not stupid for voting Republican. In fact, like it's almost like they should, but all the ones who don't, which is a ton, are really good people because they're voting against their interests. Like they're so non-racist, right? Because if like the narrative that the way they paint it is, if you're white and you vote Republican, like if the Republicans win, you're good, like you're in power. It's not true, but like some coal miner, if there's like his life doesn't get better, his life is worse. But like if you believe the narrative that the Republicans are on the side of the white supremacists, then like he should, if he just cares about himself as an individual, he should vote Republican.
Right. Yes.
So it's amazing that like the narrative would have to be that there's 100 million white people who are just such great people that they just throw away all their own individual gain in their like racial utopia that they would have, but they didn't vote for the Democrats. I mean, it sounds preposterous.
Yes.
But and the story.
Right. And I can't help myself. I just want to emphasize that it's equally preposterous and part of the same problem of racism that, again, racialized Black people who vote or think outside of traditionally accepted and expected ways of them to think are lambasted at automatically, right, without any evidence or anything, as white supremacists, as speaking white ideas, as trying to be close to whiteness, as voting for whiteness, and trying to increase proximity to whiteness. So there's a way in which Republicans and conservatives get conflated with this concept of whiteness. And there's a way in which Democrats and people who lean left get conflated with being against racism, which also means that it's conflated with Blackness. Mm-hmm. And this is part of the problem of racism, because how ironic is it that if you're racialized any particular way, but especially if we think about if you're racialized as Black, you're expected and mandated to think a particular way about anything. That expectation to me is racist. Fundamentally, it's racist because you're telling me that and seeing the world a different way, I'm not thinking for myself and I'm trying to be white, which is so nonsensical. But this is where Theory of Racelessness helps people understand and dig a little deeper. I've come to realize that the way whiteness and Blackness have been created as indeed speaking to a sort of metaphysical happening that is a non-racial happening, it does make logical sense in terms of the history and the creation of the concepts, but how it manifests itself today would require people to recognize that Blackness is understood in ways similar whiteness is, which is, I'm sorry, in the opposite way of whiteness. Whiteness has been conflated with indeed being free, right? With having more access to power, with being more powerful, with liberation, mobility, individualism, all of these things that are assigned to American ideals, with being American in the US, right? Whiteness is conflated with all of these really positive attributes and characterizations across time and across place. Blackness is conflated with the exact opposite, right? With being enslaved or with being oppressed and having less power, less agency, as being part of a collective, as being part of a group as opposed to the individual. And so in a lot of ways, the categories whiteness and Blackness have been manifested as quite literal opposites. And we see this categorization promoting problems today.
You hear white people, but then you hear Black community, right? You don't hear white community and like but Black people, you hear Black community.
Right.
Strange, right. So there's this collective of Black people, and then there's white people that act as individuals. And if they vote Republican or something, that's because they're going to get more money or something, right? It's like beneficial for them as an individual.
Right. It's they've literally been cast as sort of opposites. So in maintaining the categories in the language, now it makes perfect sense that a racialized Black person would be lambasted as working against the collective. Because but the ironic part is whiteness, that means that whiteness has also been conflated with the concept of racelessness, in that to be raceless is to be free from the strictures of racism. To be Black is to not be free from the strictures of racism. So people who exercise their freedom from racism, meaning they do think for themselves, and meaning they express themselves and they think differently, and they don't confine themselves to the box that society tries to put them in based on their perceived Blackness, etc. They're exercising their mobility, their individuality, their freedom, all of the ideas that are associated with America, their Americanness. And you often hear people, racialized Black people who are conservatives or Republican, often elevating and privileging their view of themselves as American, which I don't think is accidental, even if it is unintentional. And so their exercising of their freedom as they see themselves in the world, it really manifests in these different ways. And then our racism, our need for people to stay in the box created by racism and racialist ideology, comes to the forefront when we try to tell those people that they can't think in those ways, or they can't vote against quote unquote Black interests, etc. Which means that it's super ironic, because in staying in the box and racializing ourselves and other people, we continue to try to strip the literal freedoms from other people in ways that I don't think people are necessarily understanding or seeing or recognizing. And if we can get to a place of seeing ourselves as raceless and doing the deracialization that is necessary, then we can see how the categories and this trying to force any person of any racial group to be the way that we think that they should be, right? We would be able to liberate ourselves from those practices and that ideology, which fundamentally get us nowhere and are ultimately, I think, really regressive and a disservice to all of the Americans who came before us, who literally fought and died for their Americanness, their freedom, right? The assertion of their humanity and individuality and all of those things.
But I mean, how do you fight the people who like the, I guess, Pyrrhic victories that come? So for example, like there's words that people are way more sensitive to, words that you could use for Black people. They'll, it's way more acceptable to censure people for like racial slurs for this group. And for white people, there's nothing that they worry about. Like they have no burden, right? They don't have to police people's language. They're free to do whatever they want. They can get offended if something bothers them as an individual, but they have no burden there, which obviously, like, I agree that freedom is what people should want. Freedom is power, right? That freedom is far better. But in the interim, it feels like a victory for people, saying, look, we have power because we get to control words more. So that's a win for us, even though it's in the long run, and if you care about being free, it's a loss. Right. So how do you get people to say, like, okay, this isn't a victory? Because it feels like one, right? It feels like a victory to have to sort of have that collective, or to imagine you are that, right?
Yeah, I keep going back to something that my mentor says often, which is that there's nothing positive to being racialized. And while it can be practical utility, and there has been practical utility historically speaking, the continuation of adopting and elevating this way of seeing oneself and seeing other people, while practical, isn't actually beneficial. And I recently saw a response from Glenn Lowry, who was responding to a fictional student. Somebody wrote in and created a scenario of a fictional student named Simone, who was basically responding to Lowry's positions about the state of American culture and what's being called wokeism. And the fictional student says something to the effect of, look at all of the wins that racialized Black people have gotten over the last year or two, or however long, based on this thing called wokeness, in essence, right? There's an overrepresentation now of racialized Black people in media and increasingly in different industries. And basically the fictional student was imagining or translating those things, those happenings, as success and as a true reflection of power, especially increasing power for racialized Black people. And Lowry's response really resonated with me, because he talks about the changing tide, or the shifting direction of the wind. And he talks about how the sort of superficial winds, or the superficial aspects of what people could say, oh, look, this is power, this is a win, right? These are victories, where people giveth, they can taketh, essentially. And that as the statistical minority in American society, the increasing resentment and the sort of backlash that this thing called wokeism is continuing to receive, and will probably just continue, increasingly to receive, is such that at some point, what we're perceiving to be wins today can just as easily be losses tomorrow, because it's not something that was uh, it's not something that we basically did for ourselves. It's something that we are still dependent on these other power structures to give to us, and that those power structures could just shift with the tide, shift to wherever, whatever becomes the new profitable thing, or agenda, and accordingly, the power, the victories could be taken away. But I would extend Lowry's response a bit by talking about how when you peel back the layers of race, racialist ideology, racism, you get to better understand how the things that are conflated with racism now, particularly with Blackness, such as poverty or criminality, the things that are conflated with Black people in the United States are actually racist tropes that stem back to the creation of race as we now conceive it. And while there may have been times historically where the majority of Black people were poor, definitely can't say that there's ever been a time where the majority of Black people were criminal, but at least impoverishment, right, after emancipation, that was probably a historical reality. If we look at statistics now, which we're really only inspired to do if we can step outside of the box of race, then we can have a better understanding that in our effort to fight what we call systemic racism, we are not actually solving the problems that we're identifying as meaningful to us and people who are racialized as Black. It's kind of like the racialized white people who have historically and today been potentially manipulated to vote a certain way, even though it doesn't necessarily improve the quality of their lives in the long haul. And in that way, if more racialized Black people can recognize that they're being manipulated to vote a particular way based off of the emotion and based off of their racialization, and that allows real problems to persist that extend beyond racism, that extend beyond the problem of racism, more so into socioeconomics and things like that, then we can count the wool as lifted, and more people would be compelled, not everyone certainly, but more people would be compelled to see this thing a different way. I'll give you a concrete example. So somebody recently looked me in my eyes and told me that I have to fear for my life every time I leave my house for fear of being shot by an officer. And I asked that person, is that true? And I could tell that she was very taken aback about my question, because I could tell that nobody had questioned that kind of idea with her before. And if we dig into the statistics in terms of police shootings and all of that, then we come to find that in actuality, while racialized Black people might be disproportionately shot to death by any officer, it is still a very minuscule number in comparison to the 40 plus million people that live in this nation, such that it doesn't even come down to one person a day. So how much of a threat is that to me as a racialized Black person, really? Yeah. And are there other threats that I'm being sort of prevented from recognizing as actual threats because I'm imagining the sort of boogeyman threat of an officer shooting me every time I leave my house? What threats am I ignoring or paying less attention to? I think that's what this all comes down to. And people tend to be very reasonable once you give them the knowledge, the evidence, the education to see.
Kind of scares me, because I think right now we have a tenuous foundation, right? Because we're on this idea where like that data is good and data is useful and thinking with data is important, and we can look at data and say Black people are more likely to be shot by the cops. That's racism and that's bad. But I remember, like, when I was a kid, one of the first things I learned was that more white people are on welfare than Black people. And that statistic was sort of parroted about to remind people that, hey, it's that there's actually more white people than Black people on welfare. But of course, there's more white people that are shot by the cops than Black people. But we normalize for population size there. But there's a higher percentage of Black people on welfare. But we ignore that like normalization. We just say, hey, the gross number of white people is higher on welfare. That's important. But then we don't do that for shootings, right? So we do it sort of, we do it for on one side, but not the other. And I keep seeing that. And I keep seeing people that are trying to make these anti-racist arguments. And I mean, I saw one that was an amazing stretch. It was this idea that criminality is higher in white neighborhoods, but you don't see it because they don't call the cops as much. Which is like, what? I thought the whole meme is white people always call the cops, right? But so, and you see that it's this challenge, and because and then like it becomes so backwards. But what, like from my perspective, and I just look at it, because I don't really think people are, I think mostly in any country, like in France, you definitely see this, that, the people that were there first, the wealthier people, like the white French people, they're going to have more money and they're going to commit less crime, right? And the immigrants from Africa, the immigrants from like all over the world, usually people, they, when they come places, they don't have as much, money or like the resources. And so there's probably going to be more criminality in the marginalized people. Like I expect that. And the beauty of treating someone as an individual is it says, hey, like, we're not going to try to like throw stats at you and treat you as a marginalized person, because that would be treating you as a criminal. Like we're going to give you a chance to be whatever you want, right? Because that's how you, but instead in this country, we're saying, oh, no. As a marginalized person, you're less likely to be a criminal. You're actually just like, it's the people that are already here that are the problem. And eventually, like, they're going to get mad and say like, hey, that's not true. Like, look at these crime stats. Like, we should be scared. Like, we should be racist. And that seems like the beauty of not seeing race is that you let people be independent of some group statistic, right? Because some group statistic isn't meaningful for you, right? And it's the only way that you can like allow it's like the only way that you can allow a group of people to escape their marginalization is to not treat them as a group of people. It's treat them as individuals, right?
I think part of the problem, Tade, and it's been my experience that, people who lean, I think because racialist ideology works in the ways that it does, it has people still believing in racist ideas of various groups. And I think this also happens in ways that seem innocuous. And what I'm really talking about is this idea of two things: the question of IQ, and then also the question of criminality. And because we're looking at it through racialist lenses, we're inspired to always see and interpret the data in what I would identify as racist ways. And part of my evidence for that is, there is this idea that so-called Black people are more criminal than any other racialized group. But and statistically, if you look at percentages, for example, that seems true. So people will throw stats around like Black people are 6 times more likely to commit violent crimes than white people. Okay, 6 times whatever number seems like a very high difference, right? There's a difference there. There's a discrepancy. Another way people will put it is something like Black people commit 50% of the homicides. Also, another way people will put it is Black people comprise 50% of homicide victims. So the way that the statistics are interpreted, because racism is having its way with more of us than not, it is such that it's upholding ultimately this idea of increased criminality among racialized Black people. But what infrequently happens is a deeper analysis of, okay, tell me more about the statistic. What is the 6 being multiplied by if we say that Black people commit 6 times more violent crimes than white people? What is the number for white people, right? And if we ask that question, we find out it's something like 0.25% of racialized white people. Mind you, racialized white people, something like 220 plus million in the United States, 0.25% of that population commits violent crimes. Okay, so 6 times 0.25 is 2.5%. of racialized Black people, 40 plus million, commit violent crimes. That is a far cry from saying that the majority of Black people commit violent crimes. It's minuscule in terms of how people actually talk about it and treat it in ways that pretend to be meaningful and pretend to be innocuous, but upon further inspection aren't. And the same holds true for discussions about impoverished people, because I think I saw a study recently that sort of works to dismantle the idea that poor people are automatically more violent or more criminal. I think that is a sort of essentialization of what it is to be poor, although admittedly I haven't done enough research to say that with utmost confidence. Don't quote me on it, just throwing that out there as a possibility to bring on and invite some nuance in this interpretation of poor people as just automatically being more desperate and therefore more criminal. But it's also the case that something like 30% or so of racialized Black people live below the poverty line in the United States. That is a far cry from saying the majority of racialized Black people are poor.
I mean, every statistic that activists throw out on any side of the aisle, like the conservative or liberal, is exaggerated.
It's exaggerated.
As a statistician, that I just had to. It's very frustrating for me, because I think that I sometimes you'll talk to somebody and they'll say, like, we need to exaggerate this, because if we don't exaggerate this, people sort of won't take it seriously. And that there's these people over here that are saying that, like, Black people are like all criminals and they're bad. So I'm going to say over here that, like, the disparity, among arrests of nonviolent criminals, or, that Black people get pulled over more, like that there's strong racism. And then if I say, well, like, there's a lot of motivation behind those statistics, you haven't corrected for age, like, what are you doing? If you try to pull it back here, you might make these people happy. And it's like, that's really tough, but that's activist statistics, that they have this fear of making the wrong people happy. And they've completely given up on the idea of changing the minds of the wrong people. Like, those are irredeemable. So it's like, you don't know if you're going to make them happy or change their mind, like, but they assume that they'll never. So for me, it's like, no, I think the truth is probably better, because I might change their mind. I might not just make them happy. I might actually, and that would be good. And B, even if I don't, it's like, I'd rather not, like, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe if I don't exaggerate, then I'm going to give them fuel for their, like, rhetoric and it's bad and they're racist. But, like, I could be wrong the other way, right? And it's like, it's probably be better to be wrong when you're, like, telling the truth than be wrong because you lied, right? Just like if you have to choose. But I see that a lot. But I think this is actually a good segue to talk about Kendi, because we both read, I don't know if you've read his whole book, but you're familiar, right? And so I think he's pilloried a lot by people. And I actually think that, like, in one way, he actually breaks things down. And by not being so esoteric and not having the most complex rhetoric, he actually makes an argument that if we follow it, it's actually a great argument. So I want to hear your initial thought about him before I try to like lay that out.
Yeah, so I think the hilarious part in how he gets interpreted and how many of his texts can and probably should be interpreted as the depth of the text, I think, don't allow for too many misinterpretations.
Yeah.
No shade, all tea. The way that I read his first book, Stamped from the Beginning, was such that it was during the time I'm writing my dissertation, and actually this was part of my graduate qualifying exams. So I read the book and I was like, yes, like, this is exactly what I'm pointing to when it comes to how race and race ideology have been constructed and reconstructed and all these other things. And I adopted the language anti-race and anti-racism after I read his book and I saw the word anti-racism for the first time and Stamped from the Beginning. And I really interpreted anti-racism because of how I saw race and how he lays out, like, there's 800 pages of evidence to my point that
Yeah.
to be anti-racist, you should be anti-race. And I remember my mentor was kind of telling me like, yeah, I don't think that's what he was actually necessarily like meaning, but she didn't dispel my point because I have a wealth of evidence.
Yeah.
And then when he comes out with how to be an anti-racist, I had very high hopes because I'd read Sam from the beginning, and I was more disappointed. And I've watched countless interviews of him being interviewed, going around town, speaking at different events, and been continuously disappointed, because and part of it is just me being really particular. For example, how can you define a word with the word in it?
Yeah.
To
Yeah.
me, I'm like, okay, you're not saying anything that's meaningful sometimes, but also I've seen him double down on the same concept he explains is rooted in racist ideas. I've seen him double down on it and treat it as though it's real. And then in How to Be an Anti-Racist, he dispels humanist thought and practices, and he chastises, like literally the language he uses in one section, he chastises voices like mine. And he says that it's something to the effect of, he doesn't use this exact language because he probably doesn't know anything about philosophies of race, but he says something to the effect of skeptical eliminativists are nonsensical and living in a fake world because they, you cannot solve racism without race, without the concept of race, which I'm like, but actually you can. And so he just dispels a whole tradition of alternative philosophies of race because he can't see it any other way because he doesn't know any better yet. I'm optimistic. But then at the same time, I've had other people read him similarly to how I read Stamp from the Beginning and say, I see him as a reconstructionist eliminativist, that he's really working to reconstruct into oblivion the category of race, which I think is ultimately how you're kind of interpreting him. But unfortunately, because of how anti-racism is being practiced and because the bulk of his work, he contradicts himself in ways that don't help. I think all of those.
Like in some sense, he's showing how absurd that race is.
No, I think he contradicts himself when he starts talking about race is a made up thing, but it's real. And this is why it matters. And this is why we should operate within the category to solve racism. And we have to solve discrimination. We have to solve discrimination with anti-racist discrimination. And we have to solve this with more of this. I'm like, you're doubling down on the concept of race. And whether you intend it or not, you're encouraging other people, countless other people, to double down and triple down on the concept of race. And perhaps I would find it to be less of a quagmire and less of a critique of Kendi and his work if his work wasn't being practiced in these ways, and if he himself would have conversations with people who have different viewpoints instead of just casting them as racist, which he says repeatedly, if you disagree with me, it's because you're racist. Well, either race is a nonsensical thing that we need to dispel and do away with, or it's not, and thereby anyone who disagrees with you is racist. But you can't have it both ways.
Yeah.
And you cannot tell me that anything meaningful comes from this idea of pigeonholing people based on racialization into believing and agreeing with you for fear of being called racist, because that sounds a lot like the racism I was describing earlier as it pertains to people being forced because of how they're racialized to think or vote or act a certain way. That sounds a lot like racism itself. So yeah. I think he's very well intended. I personally give him the benefit of a doubt. I think he's very well intended. So I don't read into any kind of like maliciousness or malintent.
Let me convince you why he's right. I think I can convince you that he's actually, in some ways, maybe not intentionally, but something brilliant about what he's saying.
Let's hear it.
Okay, so I think sometimes he gets made fun of because people are like, he thinks that you need like all equity everywhere. And one time I did see him, he said, no, I don't believe that. Like, that's an exaggeration. Like, he's not bothered if there's not enough, I don't know, Black Chinese chefs who make Chinese food. Like, if there's a disparity, that he's okay with it. So that's unfair to say that he believes there should be racial equity everywhere, first of all. So like, let's talk about like some places that like he thinks there should be racial equity. So like, I think the corollary to the crime stats that the left likes to bring up to sort of counteract the right ones are like, I saw one, it was arrest rates for marijuana versus usage, and the line is, and I'm sure it's slightly exaggerated, but we're just going to take it as fact for this example, that whites and Blacks use marijuana equally, but Blacks are arrested twice as much. I said that's racism. There's no other way that could occur, because if they're using the drug at the same amount, they're arrested twice as much. So okay, sure. So from Kendi's framework, what can you do to like remedy this racism that caused this problem, right? And it's, well, you could not arrest. So for every Black person that you're going to arrest, you could flip a coin, and if it's tails, you let them free. And now you have equal arrest rates among white and Black, which is obviously like the problem with these equitable arguments, because it surmises that like there's an acceptable amount of arrest rates or an acceptable amount of poverty, and that acceptable amount is the amount that white people have. And instead of saying like, let's fight poverty, it says, let's get it equal. But I would hope that Kendi would say, okay, well, flipping a coin for every Black person that is arrested would bring you equity, but that seems incredibly unfair, right? That your fate would defend on a coin flip. So I think the marijuana arrest rate is probably the simplest way to attain equity under the rule that we're going to say you can't be totally like arbitrary with people's lives here, is to just not arrest people for marijuana. That would bring you equity. So a solution there, I think, is probably a pretty popular one, and it's one that actually should be in line with like racistness, is that you eliminate this disparity by getting rid of this stat completely. And so then that's, I think, the smaller example. And the bigger example, which is the one everybody loves to talk about, it's hot right now, that I've heard it so many times. And again, it's one of those stats that's very exaggerated. It's the racial wealth gap. And so it's one of those things where, there's difference in age, there's difference in family size, there's all these things. And then there's this other thing that like, of the really wealthy white people and the really wealthy Black people, some of the really like wealthy white people have more money. But no one thinks about that when they think about wealth. People think about poverty, right? So like, you really should sort of ignore that. And if you look just at poverty, you get sort of the same numbers again, which you see a lot of, right? You get like around twice as many Black people per capita are in poverty, right? So like, for every 100 Black people, let's say there's 30 that are in poverty. For every 100 white people, let's say there's 15. If those numbers are wrong, whatever, something like that. But there's a real gap. It's not, you'll read it, the white people have 10 times as much wealth as Black people or something like that. But there's an exaggeration, but it's an exaggeration of, there's something true about poverty, that there's a higher percentage of Black people in poverty. And I think you can just sort of define poverty as far as wealth as having no wealth, because people in poverty they have no wealth. They don't own a home. They are probably in debt. So they're in like zero or negative, right? Like that's poverty. So if you define, and obviously if they're 18, that doesn't count, like they're not kids, they're adults that have accumulated no wealth, right? So according to Kendi, the only explanation for that is racism. I think that's fine, right? It's like, wealth is not like making Chinese food. It's probably not, I would say, I'm sorry, that's not true. I would say wealth is, to some extent, cultural. You could imagine that there might be some cultures that value wealth more than others, right? But I think it's fair to say that poverty is probably not. There's probably not necessarily, at least in the US, a cultural difference that makes people want to be in poverty. Being in poverty is a lot harder, whereas the decision to acquire a lot of wealth versus some, that might be. So, okay, so we're going to give him that. And we're going to say, okay, wealth or being in poverty there's no cultural difference. And the only reason for this is racism. Maybe not current racism, but like that wealth gap, that 2-to-1 in poverty gap exists because of racism. And we say, okay, how can we fix that? Again, like what's the solution there? And the wrong answer, I think, would be to like take every Black person that's in poverty and, flip a coin and get half of the money and give them reparations for half of them. So half Black reparations. So you lift half the Black people in poverty out of poverty. Now you have equal amounts of poverty among white and Black, and you've solved the problem. It seems really unfair, right? It seems really arbitrary. And so we're going to say we can't do that. That's immoral, right? And then you say, okay, well, reparations is this popular idea. But according to Kendi, if you really take his logic, reparations are wrong. Because if we give each Black person in poverty wealth, let's say we cut them all a check for 100,000. Now the only people in poverty are white people, right? So now that 30% of Black people no longer has no wealth. So all the people on the bottom who have no wealth or like negative wealth are white. And one of Kendi's, important principles is like, if you decrease racial equity, then you are a racist. So delivering wealth to all the people in poverty that are Black in his framework is wrong. You can't do that either, right? So you can deliver to half of them, which seems arbitrary. You can't, which seems, weird and unfair also. If you deliver to all of them. So I would say his argument is a case against reparations. So like, what can you do? Well, I mean, something that I've always been in favor of, which is people sometimes disagree with me, and it's weird. People think some of my views are not very far left, and I don't think this is a far left view. I think it's a very practical view. But you look at the statistics and you get really into it, it's hard because this is not an easy thing to find, but somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 is the average. Well, some estimates are as high as 700,000, but that's the average inheritance per American. And that's the mean, not the median. The median is about 50,000. But from a redistribution perspective, you actually want the mean, because the mean is if you take all the money and you divide it among the people, that's the mean. So the median tells you sort of the average experience, like how much are your friends inheriting, probably around the median. If you're the average person, which you're not, right? But the mean is actually a useful statistic when you talk about, taking something and redistributing that thing. And so I think like you solve the racial wealth gap by redistributing inheritance. So you have, I'm sure there'll be some fight against that, but you have some large inheritance delivered to all Americans, right, at some age. So every American at age 40 or 50 or something, inherits $500,000 or $300,000, some amount depending on how accurate, the guess is, and you eliminate the racial wealth gap. So you accomplish his goal. So, and you do it. So now there's more equity because you don't have a higher percentage of Black people in poverty, and you solve the problem.
This is complicated because Wilfred Riley is a person who's been known to complicate this conversation, because inevitably the wealth gap comes up as it pertains to racialization. And he says that the median age is what's creating the illusion of the wealth gap.
That's not true. It's not. He talks about the modal age, which he likes to use that because it's a little bit of an exaggeration, to be fair. The modal age, interestingly enough, among Black men, among men is 27, and among white men it's 54. That's the modal age, which is the most.
So what does that mean? Because when he talks about it, he's at least imagining himself, and he's interpreted as dispelling the notion of the racial wealth gap, because he says if we take this modal age into account, then the wealth gap disappears. So how do you interpret that?
Rhetorical flourish by him, right? So he's using the modal age because there's a huge difference. He's saying like he's basically saying like the archetypal Black male in the US is 27. The archetypal white male is 54. So don't be surprised when they have different, occurrences of crime. Don't be surprised when there's more wealth when the whites. And then he's right in the fact that that like if you're imagining the archetypal Black guy as a 27-year-old and there is a 54-year-old, you're going to imagine there's going to be some independent of race differences. But he's using the modal age because that sounds a lot bigger. The median age is something like, I don't know, I off the top of my head, it's like 34 for Black men and 37 or 38. They are different.
Okay.
And age is also different. And so he's right. And that's what I'm saying. Like the wealth gap is massively exaggerated, right? Because it's also they'll do it by again, like the activists exaggerate everything, right? So, but when you correct for all these things, when you correct for age, when you correct for family size, when you correct for everything, there is still a wealth gap. And I would even say that I think that it's just propaganda to sort of use the fact that maybe like that to compare the wealth of, I don't know, Oprah and Elon Musk. I just don't care. So I even take them out of, any statistic to argue about black and white wealth. I think both of them are irrelevant. Right. But and so I would say what matters is the fact that there are more black people in poverty. There are more black people with no wealth. There's a lot of people with no wealth. Around a quarter of the country has no wealth. Right.
Right.
Yeah. And I'd also take out like 17-year-olds. They're 17-year-old, well, that's fine. Right. But like, people in their 40s who don't own a home, who have nothing in the bank, right? Like who have no wealth. And there's a reality that there's a higher percentage of black people. It's around 2-1, might be 1.8-1, but 2 just for the sake of argument. That's why I'm using 2, right? And there's a higher percentage of that among black people. And that's whether it's a consequence of like racism. I think it's fair to say that racism played some part in it, but independent of that, it's like that's the fact that there's anybody like that is unfortunate, and that disparity is also unfortunate, because you could imagine that disparity existing, and maybe they're getting their way. The activists are, unfortunately, in a way, they're getting their way because they are increasing, like there's this weird circular thing I've noticed, right? So if you keep talking about this wealth gap and you keep exaggerating it, which they do, then what happens when a well-meaning black or white person owns a house and he decides to rent it out to some college students? And he gets some applicants that are black, and gets some applicants that are white, and he hears about the black family wealth gap, and it's 10-1, which is a big gap. But then, so what's he going to think? Like, what happens if these fresh out of college, let's make them 22-year-old college grads, two black guys and 2 white guys, that they both applied to like live there? What's going to happen when the black guys lose their entry-level jobs because there's a pandemic and there's a shutdown? They're not going to have any money. Well, what if the white guys is, well, their parents are going to pay? And what my argument is, that's a little bit true, not very true, but if you believe the statistics, they would say it's very likely. Like, of course, they're white, the parents have tons of money, right? So like to push this as evidence of racism will make rational people who just want to make money, right, in capitalism, they might make them racially discriminate, right? So unfortunately, it's like, yeah, I guess they create racism to then solve it, right? In some sense. And that's why like race is bad in general, because like this disparity that you're talking about to try to bring people to bring awareness to racism may also create racism. But I do think that like the cat's out of the bag now. Everyone hears about the wealth gap. What Wilfred's doing is useful, because it is useful for somebody to push back and say, hey, that's an exaggeration. But again, I don't think he should lie and say, hey, that doesn't exist, right? You shouldn't.
Right.
It matters. So it exists. If they are, to be honest, if they're, kids who went to college and they're black and white, I would argue that like the argument that like the white family has more money to pay for their kid, it's probably even weaker, because the big difference that I would say matters for people is among people in poverty who probably didn't go to college. But the fact that you have a higher percentage in poverty, that I would say that in Ibram Kendi's framework, we can remedy that, but we remedy that by pulling everybody out of abject poverty through reparations across race. Because if you do reparations for one race under his framework, that's racist, right? Because that creates a disparity. Because whenever people talk about like reparations as a justified idea, if you're really anti-disparity and pro-equity, it doesn't really make sense. Because if you make it so there are now no black people in this country with no money, and there are still white people with no money, you've now created an inequitable disparity. Like your policy is created, which according to Kendi, you should not do that. So the only way to actually like equitably redistribute like money and do it in a racial way is to somehow select which black people get the money. And that sounds like a nonsensical idea. So like I think that's part of the reason why like the invoking like reparations is just kind of a guarantee that people will never get out of poverty, because say, oh, that sounds good. And you say like, well, who's going to get it? Because you're not going to give it to everybody. Right. It's stuck. So I think that what I like about like his rhetoric, whether he means it or not, that I think the end outcome of his framework is that you have to change things independent of race to eliminate racial inequities. Or you have to do some weird random selection where you choose winners and losers among the group that is suffering from disparity. I think I would hope that he would say, well, that's definitely not fair. So,
well, in terms of reparations, the general consensus, if I can call it a consensus, is that not all people racialized as Black would get it. And since the majority of people racialized as Black aren't poor in actuality, that it's not necessarily solving the problem of poorness and lifting all racialized Black people out of impoverishment, because it's also the case that people think that American descendants of slaves should be the ones who get reparations, not anyone else, because not every racialized Black person in the States is a descendant of enslaved people. And I cannot remember the percentage, but I'm sure people in the live chat will co-sign this as factual. But then it's also further complicated by the fact that people who would be racialized as white today
are also
Exactly. And so that it really isn't about race as people would prescribe it to be. It really is about the sort of nefarious impact of enslavement and
argument for like reparations is basically just, like remedying a past harm, which I've heard that argument, but I would say that wouldn't be Kendi's argument, because Kendi is really into racial equity.
Oh, right. Yeah.
You could say, like, we need to pay people back for reparations just because it's the right thing to do. But if your point is we need to do it because it's going to fix racial equity, then you can't, right? If you say that, like, anything that creates racial inequity is something that's immoral, well, now you can't do that, because you're going to create racial inequity when you do that, because you're going to make, so at the bottom, there's going to be a disparity in people that are in abject poverty post reparations.
Yeah, I think you're definitely generously reading Kendi's work, and I wish people were sort of approaching anti-racism in a sort of level-headed way that you're kind of describing, in a nuanced way. But again, because racialist ideology works the way that it does, that is not what we're seeing take effect. So I want to turn to some of the questions. One of the questions was about the Oslo study, and Nita wrote, did they lie to the Oslo patients as they did? Sort of level-headed. Going back to myself.
Oh, sorry.
Are you looking at the chat box too? So did they lie to the Oslo patients as they did the American patients? So I pulled up a paper on the Oslo study to try to get more details so that we could enlighten folks. According to this resource that I will link in the description box, the study of untreated syphilis is the Scandinavian study that was a precursor to the Tuskegee experiment. It was done in Norway, lasted for 20 years between 1891 and 1910. Participants were hospitalized as a way of protecting the community from infection until there were no signs of the disease. The study had 2,000 participants. 473 of the participants were not given treatment. Those who were not given medicine were then tracked to study how untreated syphilis progressed. And let's see, all of the participants were Caucasians. According to this, we already know how I feel about that, that inclusion. Let's see.
It was in Oslo.
It led to, right. Yeah. It led to so this study that, again, I'll put in the description box, it kind of tells the outcome of the Oslo experiment. Some of it looks to be behind a paywall. If I can find a better resource, I'll definitely share it. But I would have to imagine Tade, correct me if I'm wrong, but in most studies or experiments like this, the control group isn't told that they're the control group, right? Like what can you enlighten us on any aspect of this where people because when I think of studies like this, I think people are given a placebo and they're not told it's a placebo, right? Because that would defeat the purpose of the study. And then other people are given the actual treatment. but the people don't know if they are taking the real thing or if they're not, and that's kind of the point. So that's how I'm kind of
No,
imagining.
for Tuskegee, it's different. So like one of the claims around Tuskegee is nobody was told that they had syphilis.
Oh, okay.
That's a claim, and that's highly contested, right? So yeah, of course, if I go to you and I tell you, look, you have syphilis, I'm going to enroll you in a study, and then in the study, like, you might get paid. I might also treat your syphilis, but also try some experimental drugs, right? Because maybe like and which is sort of what they did. Like, if you look at the numbers in Tuskegee, like 28% or something of the treatment group, right, were treated actually, and 30%, like a higher percentage in the controls. But it was sort of, they still had some cases where, oh, actually we should treat this person because we're pretty sure that like at this point we should. So when you're in a study, you have a disease, and it's not usually that one arm is going to be totally non-treatment. But yes, you're right that you aren't supposed to know if you're a control or treatment. But the reason why they make this claim about Tuskegee is the line that they were told by the doctors was not that you have syphilis, but that you have bad blood. But according to Montague, bad blood is the term that was the term used to describe syphilis back then. Like, that was what they called it. So like that's a contentious claim that like they never told them, like they never told them that they had syphilis. And then depends who you believe, right? And then the other was no, they just, like, bad blood was the word. That was the word for the disease, right? And but like again, the revisionist, like, I mean, I think there's probably maybe truth to both sides, but I think that I'm sympathetic to the idea that people in 1920, right, probably didn't use the same terms we did, right? And people who are more or less educated aren't going to call it the same thing, but they were enrolled in a trial. They probably knew something was up, right? And I mean, but rates for syphilis were like very high, right? So the idea is that yes, but I think the story, the way it's retold, is they were just told they had like some bad blood, like they were just told they were tired or something. Actually they had this really bad disease. I doubt if that's the case. I don't believe that. So yeah, so that's why people. That's the part about they weren't told. Not that, yeah, you're not supposed to be told which arm you're in the trial. Like people with the coronavirus vaccines, they didn't give everybody a vaccine, right? Like Pfizer just, they did a trial and some people got a placebo. And if they got really sick from coronavirus, that's okay because we have to test the vaccine and you don't get to know, right? So like that's not an ethical consideration. The claim is they weren't told that they weren't told they have a disease. So a little bit, yeah.
Got it. And I would definitely have to do more research to see how that played out compared to how the OSLO study played out too, because people profited off of all this stuff, right? And continue to profit off of it. But yeah, even looking at the Wikipedia page, the OSLO study is mentioned here as the sort of precursor to the Tuskegee experiment. But when you brought it up to me, that was the first time that I became aware that there was even a comparable study done elsewhere. So thank you for thinking to share it with me.
It's interesting, right? Like I didn't know there was either for a long time, but it's like, why wouldn't there be? Like, why would there be this interest in how this disease works among one race of people if you from that framework, right? Like you'd want to try it in all the races. That'd be the point, right? Like that's how they thought, right? And so it's like, in some ways, like this racial perspective that people had back then, why would they test things out in Black people if they thought that Black people could work completely different, right? So it's like the narrative, it serves every cause. Like, oh yeah, of course they tested on Black people because they thought they were subhuman. Well, if they thought they were subhuman, they would also be afraid that the test in Black people wouldn't be valid in white people.
Right.
So like you kind of always see this, that, well, let's not worry about that contradiction. It's a good story.
Right.
The story wins every time. So
every time. Nita, I see your comment here. Ha ha ha, triplet brain. So that had to have been when my idea like flew out of my brain. I would say triplet brain, but I would also say the brain of somebody who has a lot of ideas that are very complex and nuanced, and it puts me at risk of forgetting my train of thought. And doesn't that sound better than triplet brain? Let's see. Constitution. A lot of comments. I'm loving the liveliness in the chat box. A lot of comments, not so much questions.
I see a question. In my view,
Where?
Oldest ANAN.
Yeah, that's Anand. Mm-hmm.
In your view, what is the oldest record we have of fossils in America with haplogroups from the old world? Oh, okay. Huh. I'm not sure what he means by that.
Let me see if I can find it, and maybe I can help.
Is he asking when people made it to the Americas, or is he asking if there's? I mean, I have read some papers that are kind of fringy, so I don't know, honestly, like I'm not an expert on ancient genetics in the Americas, so I'm a little scared to answer, but like there is some claims that like people came to the Americas well before the large, like, well, it was actually small, but the wave, the people that crossed the land bridge. So like the story that people have heard is that something like 18,000 years ago, a group of people crossed the land bridge. And those people settled the Americas, and they were the only ones here until Columbus. And then, is that true is one question, right? And I don't know actually about fossils. I know about the genetics. Like, I don't know if they found a fossil and they can say, like, when you look at its genome, that guy came across the sea from like Morocco 30,000 years ago. I'm not aware of that. There's some contentious stuff about pre-Columbus. There's some, Vikings came, but didn't have a huge impact, didn't really settle. It's totally possible. Again, I don't know how true it is. I do know that, like, when you look at the genomes, I know from the genetic side that when you look at the genomes of like some small, what we be isolated groups, they look curiously strange. I don't know if it's definitive, but they look curiously strange, as if they have admixture from the old world, like from like Africa or Europe. And these are people that we would think wouldn't have any recent contact. But then again, that could just be recent contact. Like, by recent, I mean, it could just be that like in 1500, I don't know, there was a slave in Bolivia who went and integrated with, who escaped and integrated with a tribe in the Amazon. It's possible. Again, I haven't looked into that super hard, but I will just say, as someone who's looked into a lot of this in the other parts of the world, I would almost, I mean, this isn't humans, but we do know that the monkeys in South America got there, I hope I'm not wrong, but I think a couple million years ago. And monkeys are like 5 to 10 million years old, and they arose in Africa, and they somehow made it to South America, on a boat or something, right? That they like floated there. So I would say that, like, I would never underestimate the proclivity of our ancestors to travel farther than we thought. Although I'm not an expert on fossil evidence in the Americas, I don't know if that's been found. So, but yeah, I would say that I've seen so many cases where the genetics just make no sense based on what we think about our migration history, right? Like the stories we're told that humans settled here, they stayed here. Like, humans just never stayed in one spot. And every time we do ancient genetics on a skeleton, we find like where it's almost always shocking. It almost always makes no sense for our story. So I don't know if there's, and ancient DNA is hard to harvest. I mean, like, one reason that, like, I think people should take into account is there were scientists saying that race doesn't exist 20 years ago. And maybe they were kind of guessing, but the ancient DNA that we found in the last like 15 years has really kind of proven them right. And that's sort of a big thing that people don't get, kind of. But it's hard to get DNA from an ancient skeleton, obviously. And so I don't know about any ancient DNA in the Americas. I'd have to ask people. So.
Well, thank you for thinking seriously about answering the question. I'm sure Anand will find something beneficial of what you said. Anand never ceases to amaze me with the knowledge and insight he has on seemingly everything. One question, I think, Steve, I think you were the one who asked this earlier. It was the sort of when we were talking about ethnicity, and I was talking about ethnicity as American and American as being ethnicity. And you asked a question about ethnicity and nationality and are those separate, and correct you if you're wrong. So this is the complexity of ethnicity that I think gets obscured or muddied in the context of the United States because of how we think of and imagine the existence of race. Part of ethnicity, by definition, and often includes all of the things, right? It includes culture, it includes ancestry and DNA, it includes religion, it includes nationality. And there's a way in which nationality then includes ethnicity, that this is a sort of that one can have and probably should have a meaningful multi-directional way of thinking and conceiving of both the nation and what is ethnic or ethnicity. Because if we think of other nations, we might talk about ethnicity in terms of what it is to be Chinese, for example, but which is obviously coming from the nation of China, right? But then if we study the nation, we come to understand that there are varying ethnicities within even the umbrella term of Chinese, and that these varying ethnicities operate under the umbrella of what is understood to be Chinese. And I think that translates and is transposed pretty seamlessly over other conceptions of ethnicity as it relates and overlaps with conceptions of nation in ways that I think would be more meaningful for the United States to see itself, for us to see our nation. Because if we free ourselves from the racialist ideology, thereby freeing ourselves from racism, we then have the happy side effect or the happy benefit of having a more proliferated, expansive understanding of what ethnicity is, what the word American means. And because up until this point, American has really been understood as white, both ethnically and culturally, freeing ourselves from the category of Black and white will then mean that everyone can be seen in the term American. Everyone can be seen both nationally, ethnically, culturally, and that doesn't mean a sort of assimilation happens, because usually assimilation can be not a positive thing, can be a violent thing. But it does mean that while we call ourselves a sort of melting pot, we haven't yet successfully lived up to the ideals that America has tried to live up to or professed in a lot of ways, largely because of racism and the persistence of this sort of way of thinking. But if we get outside of that, then we can then recognize how American indeed applies to all of us. And that doesn't mean that we're all the same. It doesn't mean that we, eat all the same foods, participate in culture in all the same way, listen to the same music, all of that. But it will help highlight similarities that are meaningful, such as our identity, our American identity, our Americanness, which is meaningful. There is value in having an identity with part of a nation state. And also, but that's not to say that seeing that similarity will then make it so that the suggestion is we're all ethnically the same, because that's not actually how ethnicity works, at least to my analysis. I have definitely a more expansive view on that. And that's my own, that's just my own interpretation and my own reflective of my own journey in terms of how I'm thinking about things and the kinds of questions I'm working to answer as part of a solution to racism. Because ultimately at this juncture, having just started off in this journey, I don't have all of the answers yet.
I think that we have to be all one. I mean, I think that countries with more than one ethnicity are not, I don't think that's good personally. Like, I think that multi-ethnic countries are really not where we want to go, especially with the fact that we don't really have well, like looking at black and white as two ethnicities, I think is a really dangerous idea, especially because they've been here for too long, the majority of whites and the majority of blacks, and there's no separate language. So usually when you have separate ethnic groups, like in India or China, they'll speak a different language. And because if you look at sort of the long path for that, I think it's I could be wrong, but I think it's, is it Jordan? I think it's, if I'm wrong, I'm sorry, it might be Lebanon, but I think it's Jordan. That if you look up the politics of Jordan, the and I'm gonna mess this up, but like there's a prime minister, there's a president, and then there's like a he's like a cabinet minister, but basically there's three heads. Maybe he's the leader of the Senate, but there's three. They have a three-headed government, and these three people basically have equal power, but slightly like different. In their constitution, it states that one of them has to be Christian, one of them has to be, I think, Muslim. I don't know if it's Sunni or Shia, or like one of them, and then the other one I think has to be like Druze or some third ethnicity or third religious group. And I think that that's sort of that's terrible, right? So I think that like this is because you have true ethnicity and you have true self-interest, whether or not there's a genetics or like a language. They have this idea that like we can never trust somebody of the wrong. Like if all three of them are the same, then they're just going to slaughter like everybody else. So stability is having one of each. So like then in the long run, for the US to have this, you can imagine that, okay, the president has to be white and the vice president has to be black and the speaker of the house has to be Chinese, something like it's a nightmare scenario, right? And that's what happens when you have different ethnicities sort of in the same country. And so I think that like, yeah, it's fine post immigration that you have Chinatown, that's fine. But eventually there has to kind of be everybody's in America, right? So it's not that we all have to like listen to the same music or eat the same food, but I think everyone has to be able to choose which food and which like music that they can listen to. Like there can't really be Americans that aren't allowed to do certain things. I think as long as you have that, you run the risk of this idea, which becomes reasonable, right? It becomes reasonable to say like, oh, we need a politician of this color. And then eventually you're going to say we need to have one of each color constantly in charge, because like we don't trust the other ones to advocate for us. And then the problem is, right, like once you're in that system, it's hard to get out, because if you were the prime minister in Jordan, the other two people would be opposed to you. So you do have to serve your people. Like that's your job. It's like, Congress people are elected to serve their state, right? Like, and all the other ones are. So you have to play the same game. So I think that like a multi-ethnic America is actually not a great future. I mean, at least the way I think of ethnicity, I think it's something that needs to be shared within a country.
Yeah, I think that it's not ideal, provided we continue to subscribe to the ideas of race, which are just demonstrated in your imagined scenarios, because right now that's virtually how ethnicity operates, because it's conflated with race. But post-racism, there's a way in which if we understand ethnicity, what it is at its core, then we know this idea of multi-ethnic or multicultural is a sort of redundancy that upholds the idea of race differences, primarily because it makes it seem that culture by itself, the word by itself, is not sufficiently descriptive of the source of a bunch of different origins. Mm-hmm. A bunch of different, a sort of rhizomatic identity is how Edward Glissant talks about cultural formation and oneself. And if we can see ourselves as having a sort of rhizomatic identity, which we can really only see or see better if we free ourselves from racism, then there's a way in which one can conceive of culture in a way that's more expansive, that isn't so narrowly focused on what people currently think of, which is that race produces culture as opposed to culture producing race. And so if we can get outside of that, I think it would have mostly generative and productive outcomes and benefits for everyone, because it would empower us to see the choice, to see the fluidity, to see again, that we have more in common than we have different, and that our differences aren't racial. They might be a slight difference in how we participate in American culture, but that ultimately we're participating in just that. We're participating in American culture. And I think because American culture and America, the nation, were created by people who originated from all of these different places, is reflective of how I'm thinking about American as ethnicity, and as necessarily more expansive than the ways that you just pointed to, because America is a nation of immigrants. It's a nation of people who came from all over the place, and willingly or by force, and also people who are already on these lands. And what was created was something new, and that the thing that was created that was new was unlike the cultures of the places where these people originated. But I think people have a hard time recognizing that, or really grappling with that and understanding that, largely because race ideology works in the ways that it does. And we're taught to see race as ethnicity. And so then we're taught to see the differences based largely on what is perceived to be race. And therefore we're taught to segregate, right, and differentiate and hierarchize all of the ways that we participate in American culture. I think that way of thinking about American culture is actually not reflective of the reality that we're realistically already doing the things that I'm describing, because no single person, I think you said this earlier, Tade, actually, no single person actually fits neatly into any of the stereotypes that we could cast them in based on racism, right? We are way more complex and multifaceted than fitting into any particular stereotype. So the reality is that we are culturally and ethnically American, and that our Americanness.
Like, why don't we say that? That's something I've always been like, why does no one say that?
People,
why don't you say
I think
that,
some
like,
people
you don't
do.
speak like English, you speak American Creole, like that? People would think that's funny if I said that, but they wouldn't take it serious. But like in Cape Verde, there's a bunch of places in the world where they have a culture, and their culture in the last 300 years has been like multi-origin, single culture.
Right.
But we have
Right.
multi-origin, multicultural. Like, why haven't we
Right.
why don't we call it multi-origin, single culture, and say, oh, our
Yeah.
language, like Creole, like Creole says, like, okay, like, that's not what, but it's the language, right? Like a language
Yeah.
happens so fast. In 100 years, you can have a Creole occur. In 100 years, you have like the native speakers, kids, parents, grandparents, all speaking a Creole that exists now. But why don't we use those terms?
I think, psychologists would say that it boils down to human beings need to feel part of a group, and that because of the history of our nation, the group formation has largely centered on race ideology, right? Because of racism hiding its face as race here. So I think that's what's limiting more people from thinking about American in this more complex way. And when I hear terms like multicultural and stuff, I always think about the irony, because to me, adding the multi is redundant, because culture, if you understand culture and how it's formed and how we all participate in culture, then you understand that it is multi. You don't need to add multi in front of it, right? But I really do think that it's a sort of black and white way of thinking about ourselves and other people that preclude more people from seeing it that way. And I'm inspired by Caribbean and West Indian writers like Edward Glissant, who I mentioned earlier. Kamau Brathwaite is another one. Derek Walcott, Samuel Selvin, Erna Broadber, Shani Mutu, a whole host of intellectuals from other regions and places who do talk about and theorize culture and ethnicity, and, to their credit, race in these other more complex and nuanced ways. But again, I in having specialized in African American, American, and Caribbean literatures, and thereby the attending histories, it is clear to me that too many American thinkers or thought leaders are still operating from within the box of racialist ideology in ways that people in the Caribbean have at least attempted to get themselves out of or expand, make less constricting, right? Because they tend to talk about race, ethnicity, culture, all of those things as what people would call Creole or Creolized. There's this whole theory of Creolization. And they essentially say that because of the Middle Passage, because of the violent interaction of people from different places that then went to the Americas, something new was indeed created, for better or for worse, right? And that the new thing that was created were, to their mind, new races because of intermixing, right? So they talk about what Americans would conceive of as a sort of mulatto race being created in the Americas. And then they talk about that mixing also extends into culture and how, a person, if you're in a place colonized by the French, and then subsequently colonized by Belgium or something like that, and then you're independent, through different points of time, you see yourself as equally French and also of the nation that you're born in. And that means that your language, you probably speak French, right? And you probably speak English, and you might speak some kind of Creole or something else that would be identified as dialect. You probably eat the foods unique to whatever country you're from because of that initial violent interaction, and so on and so forth. And so they talk about themselves in ways that I think are more expansive, but not expansive enough for the United States, because they still uphold the category of race. And although they point to the fact, I think probably their conclusion is we're all mixed, which would effectively undo our belief in race. I think the fact that they're still sort of ascribing to the one drop rule type of way of thinking about race, for me, is still problematic, because I think in our society, because race operates the ways that it does, and that racism hides its face as race, we would do well to just dispel the notion altogether. But that's a good region to go to expand one's thinkings about culture and ethnicity. And I think I have a PDF actually of Glissant's Poetics of Relation, where he really talks and theorizes about ethnicity and culture, all the things in the ways I'm describing, that I'm happy to share with anyone who wants it. Let me know in the chat box. But Tade, I think you would actually really get a lot from it.
Yeah, I mean, Caribbean writers they're so prolific. It's amazing. I mean, these islands are tiny. It's just,
yeah, and the reach of their thought cannot be undervalued.
Right, like my friends from one of my best friends here is from Grenada, and it's like 100,000 people, and it's like so small. And like they were colonized by, I think, the Spanish and then the English.
Yes,
you have this like, but then there's just a unique identity of being from Grenada, right? And it just encompasses like all those things, and we just don't have that here. And I don't know if is it because we have too much recent immigration, too much old immigration. It's weird that we don't have that. I mean, people say we have this whiteness, that like every group becomes white, but I think that's a stretch, personally. Like, have you heard this idea
that every group becomes white? I've definitely heard the racializing of white for many groups, but in my analysis of the history, it's really attached to the fact that what I was talking about earlier, that whiteness has become conflated with freedom and access to power and having power and money. So you get people who are really racialized as Asian being racialized as white, or understood or seen as white, largely because they tend to do very well economically, right? And again, that it just underscores and highlights my pointing to how racism is hiding its face as race. If whiteness if certain measures of success keeps being coded and understood and interpreted as white, like, what does that say about the framework in the first place? And why are we still holding?
Well, it says that the goal would be to just make all of America white, right? Everybody. Right? And that's the only positive end game there.
Well, so this
Yeah,
this
you have to
is
let everybody in.
this is something I've been thinking about deeply because um, the more attention theory of racelessness gets, the more viciousness it gets directed at me. And some people have accused me after the Newsweek piece, accused me of um, trying to be white and like hating myself and being anti-black. I'm like, okay,
Yeah.
all right. But somebody tried it. Somebody on Twitter tried it. And the hilarity of it, or the irony, is whiteness has been within the category of whiteness and blackness have been coded all of these things which are really viewed as very opposite things, and there's infrequently the merging of the two things. So for whiteness, something like individualism; for blackness, collectivism. And people make the mistake, Americans make the mistake of infrequently recognizing how both things exist, both things have power and agency, how there is no collective without the individual, right? And so on and so forth. And it's largely because we're still thinking in these black and white ways. And whiteness has also been, unfortunately, conflated with what I would identify as racelessness. And because there's a way in which the removal of the race specific is interpreted across time as signaling whiteness. In the Negro artist in The Racial Mountain, Langston Hughes in 1926 starts that essay by lambasting Countee Cullen for saying that he wanted to be a poet, not a Negro poet. Langston Hughes translated it in the essay as saying that Countee Cullen wants to be a white poet, which he then further translates as Countee Cullen wants to be white. And so there's a way in which a poet or an American, any noun that we could put in there that is not race specific is interpreted not as raceless, right? Or meaning a category for human, for everyone, but as signaling whiteness. And I'm like, how problematic is that? So part of my efforts too in helping people understand theory of racelessness and better understand these race concepts, it includes the fact that it points to the fact that racelessness in actuality embodies the things assigned to whiteness and assigned to the other categories in reality, because it's a mistake to presume that racelessness is only whiteness, and thereby if somebody wants to assert their racelessness, they're asserting their whiteness. No, that's racism having its way with us, because that's writing entire groups of people outside of all of the things that are attached to whiteness, like freedom, for example, right? Yeah. So if people actually want freedom from racism, if we want to transcend racism, we have to embrace racelessness as the embodiment of that which is written into whiteness and blackness and the other categories. Which will then, if we get that kind of deeper understanding of what racelessness is and stop just conflating it with whiteness and making it therefore problematic, then more of us get what we want. And I want people to hear me. This is not for you, Tade, it's for people viewing. I want people to hear me when I say that I'm not advocating for people to just completely ignore the concept of race, or the fact that people believe in the concept of race. If that were the case, I wouldn't be talking about the concept of race all day, every day on my channel, or in my publications, or in my forthcoming book. What I'm calling for and what I'm encouraging is the recognition of racism masquerading itself as race, and the conflation of race with other meaningful things that actually exist, which naturalize, have the unfortunate outcome of naturalizing the concept of race, which means naturalizing racism itself. That's what I'm calling for, is attention to that, recognition of that. And then also a recognition of the historical genealogy of people racialized as Black who have had alternative philosophies of race that get marginalized and excluded because racism works in the ways that it does. And if we can tend to those alternative philosophies, like a philosophy of racelessness, which is a nonpartisan framework, then we can get more of what we want, which is actually solve and resolve the problem of racism.
Yeah.
But we cannot do that if we continue to double down on the concept of race, which is a symptom of racism and is racism itself, because we will continue to stay in the cycle of racism, which is something Theory of Racelessness sincerely is trying to get more people out of the quagmire of doing.
Yeah.
So in the
This concept I
future,
see a lot.
I'm sorry, Tade, just give me 1 second.
Right.
Sorry. In the future, when the work is done, when we are on the other side of the problem of racism, then the outcome would be the sort of obliteration of categories of race from frameworks of analysis and so on and so forth, because racism would then be truly a historical problem. Mm-hmm. But until then, I recognize, and through Theory of Racelessness, people who rock with us recognize that we have to talk about the problem of racism, and by extension, the problem of race, but we just have to do it in a way that's more generative and productive and actually gets people across the finish line of transcending race, because how we've been doing it isn't going to work for all of the reasons that I hope are rendered really super clear for people. Okay, Tade, please, the floor is yours.
Say, like, I see this sophomoric response to people like you, that people say, like, and people say this to me sometimes too. It's kind of frustrating when they're like, oh, well, you don't believe that race has a strong biological basis, and you believe in racelessness, so you shouldn't be talking about race. And it's just frustrating, because it's the idea that you have to believe in witchcraft to be like bothered by people like burning witches, right? It's not necessary to believe in it, right? Like, and it's just, but I keep seeing that where it's like, this person doesn't think she's Black, so she can't talk about Blackness, or you don't believe in race, so how can you know anything about race? But I mean, there were witch trials and they killed witches. It doesn't mean that I believe that those were like witches, right? And like, there are probably people who didn't believe in witches that were against, in fact, the only people that were surely against the burning of witches in Salem, Massachusetts, were probably people who didn't believe in witchcraft. Right? Like, they were the heroes, not the villains, right? It wasn't the people that believed in witchcraft, but believed that witches have rights. Like, they weren't the one, or that believed that we need a witch president, right? It was the people, right? Like that, you didn't have to do that to be against witchcraft, but there's this idea that you have to, right? That like, if you step out, and there's this other idea that if you step out, there has to be this insidious reason. Like, you just are ashamed. Like, that's why you don't believe in this, because you're ashamed. And that this frustrates me more than anything, because it's like the voices of people who see through the construct. You have to value those people too. Like, even if like, you're like married to the construct, you can't use like that type of logic, right?
Yeah, that's really deep, Tade. I just had a moment in your sort of restatement of the observations in terms of the kinds of pushback that we do get. Yeah, I think that's really, really powerful. And also it speaks to the point that people needn't subscribe to racial skepticism to be an eliminativist. I've said it many times, I'll say it again. My own mentor is a constructionist eliminativist. So he operates from within the category. He does see the category as quasi real. And yet he's working to seek its destruction, because he concedes the fact that there's nothing positive about being racialized. So there's that. And so, yeah, sometimes people get stuck on the skeptical aspect of it, so that they kind of block themselves from seeing the practical utility and also inherent benefits of eliminativism. But one needn't be a skeptic to be an eliminativist. I do think, though, that skepticism and teaching people about skepticism and really just expanding people's knowledge in terms of what philosophies of race there are, I think it does get us to eliminate nativism closer, because the more people who see through the smoke, if you will, inevitably end up concluding that eliminativism is the thing that makes the most sense. And if we're sincere about transcending the problem, and this isn't just a sort of, effort to uphold the mainstream narrative that's always been the mainstream narrative, then eliminativism is usually how people end up landing, or where people end up landing.
mean, like we eliminated witchcraft essentially. I mean, we have most of the developed world. I mean, there's still some witches, but I mean, it's just interesting that it probably took a while, and you probably had to people that were against witch trials probably had to use like that, they had to speak to people that believed in witchcraft, and they had to use like that the like language of a witchcraft framework, but they still didn't have to believe in it, right? And so it seems insane to me that you have to be wedded to race to comment on it. And it also seems like what's frustrating is I think the best argument for being a skeptic is actually the fact that the arguments for not being a skeptic are sometimes constructionist and sometimes like naturalist. You'll see this weak argument made that's like a naturalist argument, and then you'll see those both get points against against the fact that you shouldn't be, or for the fact that you shouldn't be a skeptic. But if you think about it, like the fact that it's incoherent is actually an argument to be a skeptic, right? So it's like this idea that that there's a community or like a collective. That's a constructionist idea, right? Because you can imagine, okay, you have Black neighborhood and white neighborhood, right? You have that over and over again. Those are like communities, and they're separate, and they live in a different place and different socioeconomic status. But then so that's fine. That's that's a construction of race, which is really like neighborhood or like region, right? But then they don't say like, well, what do the Black communities think? They say Black community, as if there's one. So that's a naturalist idea again, right? So you started with the constructionist idea, then you went naturalist again. And it's like you might say, like, how do women feel about abortion? It's a naturalist idea of what a woman is, right? We didn't say how does the female community, right? So, but with race, we do both. It's naturalist and so to me, it's like that incoherence is good evidence that like you shouldn't really stake out a position either way, right? That like you're going to get these bits and pieces where it looks like both, but something that looks like two things probably isn't doing a good job at having any real sort of like real meaning behind it. So like race moves to be like sort of whatever you want, right? And that's why I think that is the better argument to be a skeptic, not to beat down every piece of like evidence, because there's a lot of evidence that race is constructed, right? And there's some evidence of like like we talked about this 10% of your genome, although again I think that's misleading. But there's some of this idea to look at race as like ancestry, but like neither one is really strong enough to like justify race. And so when people sort of believe in it, they end up sort of grabbing both, right? And then they merge them all like into one thing. And it does seem like it's something that that if it was really social construction, then people wouldn't have a problem saying, well, then ideas like let everybody be white wouldn't sound funny, right? Like that sounds offensive and that sounds funny because people aren't really constructionists, right? So it's
Yep.
like when people are offensively racist, it's because they're being fully construction or fully a naturalist, right? Like you really can't be either one. Like people will get mad at you if you go full construction. If you go full naturalist, then you're going to suggest things like differences in IQ and stuff. That's going to piss people off. If you go full construction, that's going to piss people off. So it's like, clearly it's not one or the other. It's both whenever it needs to be, in whichever way to make people fight as possible. So, yeah.
Yes. Tade, thank you.
Yeah,
I feel like that was a great place to end this
Are there
conversation.
Any other questions? Is that it?
Even if there are, we can tend to them at another point, another time. My brain is tired.
Stuff, so.
Exactly. Yeah. This was so fun to speak with you again. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for your support of our work at Theory of Racelessness. It means a lot, and I learn immensely from you. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll put some stuff together for you in the next couple of weeks, so we'll be in touch.
That's gonna be awesome. Okay. Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone for coming and spending time with us, especially for those who have been here since the beginning of this conversation. Y'all are the real MVPs. Love, light, happy holidays to everyone celebrating this weekend and also New Year's. I'm wishing you the absolute best, and I will see y'all very soon.